I came home to my wife's father pinning my son against the wall. He was whispering that if the boy told anyone, he would disappear. I wanted to protect my marriage, but saving my child meant exposing the monster everyone called family. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The Chicago wind was howling off the lake, throwing sheets of freezing rain against the windshield of my old sedan. I am a forensic accountant. I spend 50 hours a week buried in spreadsheets, tracking discrepancies, finding missing money, and making sure the numbers align for mid-level corporate clients. It is quiet, methodical work. It pays $70,000 a year. That is a decent living for a normal man. But in the world my wife Camille belongs to, $70,000 is what her father spends on a weekend vacation. I left the office early that day. A massive headache had been splitting my skull since noon. I just wanted to go home, take an aspirin, and help my 10-year-old son Leo with his math homework. Leo is a quiet kid. He observes everything. He has this habit of watching adults talk, tracking their expressions like he is trying to solve a puzzle. He is my entire world. I parked in the driveway of the massive stone house Camille insisted we buy. Her father, Roland Hayes, had provided the down payment. Roland is a commercial real estate developer. He owns half the high-rises in the South Loop. He is a man who builds empires and crushes anyone who stands in his way. Providing the down payment was not a gift. It was a chain around my neck. It gave him an excuse to have a key to our house. It gave him an excuse to treat my living room like his personal waiting area. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was dead silent. Camille was out at a charity luncheon with her elite friends. She thrives on the status her maiden name brings. I shook off my wet coat and called out for Leo. There was no answer. I walked past the kitchen and headed down the long hallway toward the back of the house. That is where the heavy mahogany doors of the private study are located. As I got closer, I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a sharp, heavy thud. It sounded like a bag of sand hitting a solid wood wall. Then came the frantic, desperate sound of shoes kicking against the baseboards. I shoved the study door open. Time stopped. The scene burned itself into my memory so deeply that I will never be able to erase it. Roland Hayes, wearing a pristine $4,000 tailored suit, had his massive hand wrapped tightly around my son's throat. He had Leo pinned entirely off the ground against the towering mahogany bookshelves. Leo's face was turning purple. His small hands were clawing frantically at Roland's thick wrist. His feet were kicking uselessly in the empty air. Roland was not yelling. He was not out of control. That was the most terrifying part. His face was entirely calm. His eyes were dead and flat. He leaned his face inches from my son's ear and whispered in a voice so cold it felt like venom. "Tell anyone what you saw, and you will disappear." I did not think. I did not weigh the consequences. I did not care that this man was worth $100 million or that he funded my lifestyle. I did not care that he was my wife's father. A primal, violently protective rage exploded in my chest. I crossed the room in 2 strides and lunged at his back. I slammed my shoulder directly into his spine with every ounce of strength I had. The impact sent us both crashing sideways across the room. We shattered a glass end table and slammed onto the hardwood floor. Roland grunted as the breath was knocked out of his lungs. His grip on Leo broke. My son dropped to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat and coughing violently. I scrambled to my feet, placing my body squarely between Roland and my son. My fists were clenched. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a sledgehammer. I was ready to kill him. I was ready to tear this billionaire apart with my bare hands if he took one single step toward my boy. Roland pushed himself up off the broken glass. His lip was split open from the fall. A thin stream of bright red blood ran down his chin, dripping onto the crisp white collar of his custom shirt. A normal man would be shocked. A normal man would be apologizing, trying to explain away the absolute madness of choking a 10-year-old child. Roland Hayes did not apologize. He wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his thumb, looked at the red stain, and then looked at me. And he laughed. It was a dark, amused chuckle. He stood up slowly, brushing the glass off his expensive trousers. He straightened his tie. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at me not with fear or guilt, but with the utter disdain a king reserves for a peasant. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life, Andre. His voice was completely steady. I kept my arms raised, my eyes locked on his every movement. I told him if he ever touched my son again, I would put him in the ground. I told him he was a monster. I shouted that I was calling the police right now and pressing charges for assault. Roland took a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his lip. He smiled a cold, predatory smile. "Call them," he challenged, spreading his arms wide. "Call the police, Andre. Tell them the great Roland Hayes assaulted your boy. Do you know who the police chief plays golf with on Sundays? Me. Do you know who funded the district attorney's entire re-election campaign? Me. You are nothing in this city. You are a ghost. You are a mid-level pencil pusher making $70,000 a year. I dropped $70,000 on a watch without blinking. You have absolutely no power here." I could hear Leo whimpering behind my legs. I reached a hand back, feeling my son's small, shaking shoulder. I kept my eyes completely fixed on Roland. "You choke a child," I yelled, my voice trembling with rage. "You choke your own grandson." Over what? What could he possibly have done to justify that? Roland's eyes narrowed. The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, calculating shadow. He glanced at Leo, then back to me. The boy was snooping where he does not belong. He has a habit of touching things that are not his. I was simply teaching him a lesson about boundaries. In the real world, Andre actions have severe consequences. Something you are about to learn very intimately. He stepped closer. I braced myself for another fight, but he just stopped 2 feet away. He leaned in, his imposing frame towering over me. "You think you are protecting your family, Andre. You think you are playing the hero, but you are just a parasite living in the house I bought, eating the food my wealth provides. You are a temporary fixture in my daughter's life. If you try to cross me, I will not just take your job. I will erase your entire existence. I will grind you down until you are begging on the street. I will take this boy, and I will take your wife, and I will make sure you never see a single dime or a single face from this family ever again." The sheer arrogance of his threat was staggering. He was standing in my house, bleeding from the mouth, openly admitting he would destroy my life, and he felt absolutely untouchable. I realized in that moment that he was not making empty threats. Roland was a man who moved pieces on a chessboard while the rest of us were just trying to survive the day. He had the money, he had the lawyers, he had the politicians, but he did not have my son. I told him to get out of my house. I told him to walk out the front door before I beat him unconscious and dragged him out myself. Roland stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He tossed the bloody handkerchief onto the floor between us. He buttoned his suit jacket, giving me one last look of absolute disgust. "You are going to regret this, Andre. You have no idea what you just stepped into." He turned and walked calmly out of the study. I listened to his heavy leather shoes echo down the hallway. I heard the front door open and slam shut. The silence that followed was suffocating. As soon as he was gone, I dropped to my knees and pulled Leo into my arms. My boy was trembling violently. His breathing was ragged, and I could already see the dark, angry red marks forming in the shape of massive fingers around his small neck. Tears were streaming down my face. I held him as tightly as I could, rocking him back and forth on the hardwood floor. I told him he was safe. I told him nobody was ever going to hurt him again. I promised him that I would protect him no matter what it cost me. Leo buried his face into my shoulder. He was crying, but he was also doing something else. He was squirming. He pulled back slightly, looking at the doorway to make sure his grandfather was truly gone. His wide, terrified eyes met mine. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse and raspy from the choking. I smoothed his hair back. "It is okay, Leo. He is gone. You do not have to be afraid." "No, Dad," he gasped, clutching my shirt. He was hiding something. Behind the bookshelf. I saw him move the wood. I frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Buddy? Leo reached into the pocket of his jeans. His small hand was shaking so badly he could barely pull it out. When he finally opened his fist, I stared at what he was holding. It was a key. It was not a normal key. It was a small, heavy piece of brass. It was deeply rusted around the edges, looking like it had not been touched in 30 years. Stamped into the metal was the number 407. Just beneath the number was the faint, worn outline of an old banking logo. I looked from the key to the massive mahogany bookshelf behind us, the same bookshelf Roland had pinned Leo against. I saw him. Leo whispered, his voice breaking. He pulled a piece of the wood away. There is a hole back there. He was putting a big black book inside it. When he turned around to put the wood back, this fell out of the book. It hit the rug. I picked it up. He saw me do it. That is why he grabbed me, Dad. That is why he said I would disappear. He wanted it back. A cold chill swept down my spine. I took the rusted key from my son's trembling hand. The metal felt heavy and freezing against my palm. Roland Hayes was a billionaire. He had access to the most secure vaults in the country. He had offshore accounts, digital encryption, and private security. Why would a man with endless resources build a false wall in my home to hide a book? And why would he be willing to murder his own grandson over a rusted 30-year-old key that fell out of it? My mind as a forensic accountant began racing. People only hide things when they are afraid. They only use analog, forgotten vaults when they cannot risk a digital footprint. Roland was terrified of whatever this key opened. He was terrified of whatever was in that hidden ledger. He had constructed an entire illusion of absolute power, but this piece of rusted metal was a crack in his armor. I squeezed the key in my fist and looked at the door. I knew my wife Camille would be home soon. I knew she would find out what happened. I also knew deep in my gut that when forced to choose between a husband with a modest salary and a father with a $100 million empire, she would choose the money. The storm was coming. The entire weight of the Hayes family was about to crash down on my head. I helped Leo to his feet. I wiped the tears from his cheeks and told him he was the bravest kid I had ever known. I slipped the rusted key deep into my own pocket, hiding it completely out of sight. Roland told me I had no power. He told me I was a ghost. He thought he could bury us because he had the money. But he had left a loose thread, and I have spent my entire life pulling at loose threads until the whole fabric unravels. The worst day of my life had just started, but Roland Hayes had just handed me the weapon I would use to destroy him. The heavy oak front door swung open with a loud thud that echoed down the long hallway. The sound of high heels clicking against the imported marble floor followed immediately. It was Camille. She was laughing on her cell phone, her arms full of bags from designer boutiques downtown. Her voice was light and careless, perfectly oblivious to the nightmare that had just unfolded in her own home. She stepped into the doorway of the study. The phone slipped out of her hand and clattered onto the floor. Her smile vanished. She did not look at the shattered glass covering the rug. She did not look at me standing there with my fists still clenched. And most devastating of all, she did not look at our 10-year-old son cowering behind my legs, trembling and clutching his bruised throat. Camille only saw one thing. She saw her father. She saw the great Roland Hayes leaning against the leather sofa, dabbing a streak of bright red blood from his split lip with a silk handkerchief. She screamed his name and rushed across the room. She dropped her designer bags and fell to her knees beside him, her hands frantically hovering over his face. She asked him what happened. She asked him who did this to him. She treated him like a wounded king. I stood there in absolute disbelief. I waited for her to turn her head. I waited for her maternal instinct to kick in. I waited for her to ask why her only child was crying on the floor, but she never turned around. Roland looked at his daughter. Then he looked at me. I saw the absolute malice in his eyes. I saw the calculated performance begin. He let out a ragged, theatrical sigh. He placed his heavy hand on Camille's shoulder and shook his head with a look of profound disappointment. He told her I had lost my mind. He kept his voice remarkably calm, playing the victim perfectly. He said I came home early from work in a violent rage. He told Camille that I demanded a massive cash loan from him. He fabricated a story on the spot, claiming I had secretly amassed tens of thousands of dollars in gambling debts and that I threatened to ruin the family name if he did not pay them off immediately. When I refused to be extorted by a desperate man, Roland said, his voice dripping with fake sorrow, "Your husband attacked me. He tackled me from behind like an animal. He smashed me into the table. I tried to calm him down for your sake, Camille, but he is out of control." My jaw dropped. The lie was so smooth, so effortlessly delivered that for a fraction of a second, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. It was the masterful work of a sociopath. I stepped forward. I shouted that he was a liar. I pointed a shaking finger directly at Roland and told Camille the exact truth. I told her I walked into this room and found her father pinning our son against the wall by his throat. I told her Roland had threatened to make Leo disappear. "Look at him, Camille!" I yelled, my voice cracking with desperation. "Just look at your son. Look at his neck." Camille finally turned her head. She looked at Leo. She saw the dark, angry red fingerprints blooming across his skin. For 1 second, I saw a flicker of horror in her eyes. I saw the mother inside her recognize the truth. But then I saw something else. I saw the calculus taking place in her mind. If she admitted her father was a monster, she would have to stand against him. If she stood against Roland Hayes, she would lose the mansion. She would lose the trust fund. She would lose the charity luncheons, the luxury cars, and the absolute power that came with being a Hayes. She looked at her bruised child, and she weighed his safety against her inheritance. The inheritance won. Her face hardened into a mask of pure ice. She stood up and glared at me with a hatred I had never seen before. She pointed at the bruises on Leo's neck and told me I was sick. She said I must have grabbed him during my violent outburst. She accused me of using my own child as a shield to cover up my crimes. "You are disgusting, Andre," she spat, her voice shaking with artificial rage. "You attack my father in my own home, and then you try to blame him. You try to manipulate me with my own son." Before I could even respond to the sheer insanity of her accusation, the front door opened again. Heavy footsteps rushed down the hallway. It was Camille's older brother, David, and his wife, Chloe. They had been invited over for dinner. They walked into the study and stopped dead in their tracks. David immediately rushed to his father's side, but Chloe did not look at Roland. Chloe looked directly at me. Chloe was a woman born into old money. She was a white American who treated the Hayes family fortune like her own personal treasury. She had always hated me. From the day Camille and I started dating, Chloe made it her mission to remind me that I was an outsider. She constantly pointed out that I did not go to the right schools. She mocked my modest accounting salary. She viewed me as a threat to her share of the empire. Now, seeing me standing amidst the broken glass, Chloe saw her perfect opportunity to finally eliminate me. She crossed her arms and let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She looked me up and down like I was a piece of trash that had blown in off the street. "I always said you married a street rat, Camille," Chloe said, her voice echoing loudly in the tense room. "I told you from the very beginning. Men like him do not love women like us. They love the lifestyle. They are parasites. He has been feeding off this family for a decade, and now that the money tap is shut off, he shows his true colors." I told Chloe to keep her mouth shut. I told her she had no idea what she was talking about. I stepped in front of Leo to shield him from her vicious gaze. But Chloe just smiled. It was a cold, elitist smile. She stepped closer, weaponizing every ounce of her privilege. She spoke slowly, making sure every word cut deep. "You really thought you could play in this league, Andre," she mocked. "You thought your little accounting degree made you one of us. But you are just a desperate man trying to extort a fortune you could never earn yourself. You are pathetic. You are a violent broke nobody, and you are going to rot in a jail cell by morning." David chimed in, pointing a finger at my chest. He told me I was lucky he did not beat me to death right there. He told me the Hayes family would crush me so completely that I would never find a job in this state again. They were all standing together now, Roland, Camille, David, and Chloe. A wall of extreme wealth, absolute power, and unified deceit. They had completely rewritten reality in less than 5 minutes. They had turned a grandfather attempting to murder a child into a story about a greedy, violent husband throwing a tantrum over a loan. I looked at Camille. The woman I had loved for 12 years. The woman I had built a life with. I made one last desperate attempt to reach whatever soul she had left. "Camille," I said, lowering my voice, "I am begging you. Look at Leo. Really look at him. He is terrified of your father. He is shaking. Are you really going to let them do this? Are you really going to trade your son's safety for their money?" Camille did not flinch. She did not shed a single tear. She reached out and held her father's arm, presenting a united front. "The only person my son needs to be safe from is you," she said coldly. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, Camille reached up to her left hand. She slid the platinum wedding band off her finger. She held it in the air for a brief moment, letting the diamond catch the light of the chandelier. Then she tossed it. The ring hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clink. It rolled across the room and stopped directly at the tip of my shoe. "Pack your trash and get out of my house, Andre," she commanded. "You are done here. You are done with this family. I will have the divorce papers drawn up by my father's attorneys tonight. I will make sure you walk away with absolutely nothing. Leave your keys on the counter." She pointed toward the door. David stepped forward, puffing out his chest, ready to enforce her command. Roland just stood in the background, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He had won. He had snapped his fingers and erased me from my own home. I looked down at the ring on the floor. I did not pick it up. It meant nothing to me anymore. The marriage was dead. The woman standing in front of me was a total stranger. She was completely hollowed out by greed and the desperate need to protect her social status. I turned my attention to Leo. He was gripping my pant leg, his small knuckles white with fear. "I am not leaving without my son," I said firmly. My voice did not shake. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "I will never leave him in a house with that monster." Camille let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Take him," she sneered, waving her hand dismissively. "Go ahead and take him, Andre. Drag him out into the freezing rain. Let him see what life is really like with a failure for a father. You have no money. You have no power. You will both be begging on the streets by Friday. And when you realize you cannot feed him, you will bring him crawling back to me." Chloe chimed in from the back. "Good luck finding a hotel that takes your credit score, Andre." I did not waste another breath on any of them. I knelt down to Leo's level. I looked him in the eyes and told him everything was going to be all right. I told him we were leaving this place and we were never coming back. He nodded silently, tears still falling down his cheeks. I took his hand. We walked out of the study. I did not look back. I did not pack a single piece of furniture or grab any valuables. I walked into our bedroom, grabbed a single canvas duffel bag, and shoved a few days' worth of clothes for both of us inside. I grabbed our passports and my laptop. That was it. 12 years of a life packed into one bag in 3 minutes. We walked down the long hallway toward the front door. The house felt massive, cold, and entirely foreign. It was a museum of fake love. I opened the heavy oak door. The freezing Chicago downpour hit us immediately. The wind whipped rain across the porch, soaking my shirt in seconds. The sky was dark gray, reflecting the brutal reality of what lay ahead. We had no safety net, D. We had no family to call. We were walking into a storm with absolutely nothing. But as I put my arm around my son's shoulders to shield him from the freezing wind, I felt the small heavy weight in my front pocket. The rusted brass key. Number 407. Camille thought she had destroyed me. Chloe thought I was a parasite they had successfully exterminated. Roland thought he was an untouchable king who had just crushed a peasant. They were all celebrating their victory in the warm, dry mansion behind me. They had the millions. They had the power. They had the lawyers, but I had the key, and I was an accountant. I knew that every empire built on lies has a ledger hidden somewhere in the dark, and I was going to find it. I pulled Leo close, zipped up his jacket, and we stepped off the porch into the freezing rain, walking away from the illusion and stepping into the fight of our lives. I did not sleep a single second that night. Leo and I spent the first few hours parked in the corner of a 24-hour grocery store lot. I kept the car heater running until the fuel needle dipped too close to empty. Then I turned off the engine and wrapped my winter coat around my son. He slept fitfully in the passenger seat. Every time a car drove past, he would flinch and pull his knees to his chest. My mind is normally a disciplined machine. I am trained to organize chaos, to balance ledgers and find the truth in the numbers. But sitting in the freezing cold, I was completely fractured. I kept replaying the image of Roland holding my boy by the throat. I kept hearing my wife Camille telling me to get out of my own home. As the sun finally began to rise over the gray Chicago skyline, my survival instincts kicked in. I needed capital. I needed to get to my office. I had a paycheck waiting. I had client files I could leverage. I planned to ask the senior partners for an advance on my quarterly bonus to secure a safe apartment. I told myself that the law and my career would protect us. I was completely wrong. I drove to the downtown financial district and parked a few blocks away from my accounting firm. The financial district was coming alive around me. Men and women in tailored suits holding expensive coffees were walking briskly past me. They looked right through me. Just yesterday, I was one of them. Now I was a ghost. I told Leo to lock the car doors and stay hidden in the seat. I promised him I would be back in exactly 15 minutes with enough money to get us a warm hotel room and a hot breakfast. I ran through the morning drizzle to the tall glass doors of my building. For 7 years I had walked into this lobby. For 7 years I had been a loyal, meticulous employee who caught financial discrepancies no one else could see. I approached the security turnstiles and tapped my employee badge against the scanner. Instead of the familiar green light, the scanner flashed red. A harsh electronic buzz echoed in the quiet lobby. I tapped the badge again. Red light. A heavy hand fell on my shoulder. I turned around and saw the building security chief standing there. Behind him was Greg, the human resources director for my firm. Greg was clutching a small cardboard box filled with my desk photographs, my favorite pen, and my coffee mug. Greg would not look me in the eye. He was a man who usually greeted me every morning with a joke about the weather. Today his face was pale and he was sweating despite the cold draft in the lobby. He pushed the cardboard box into my chest. He told me my employment was terminated effective immediately. I stared at him in absolute shock. I demanded an explanation. I asked him how they could fire me without a review, without notice, and without a severance package. Greg glanced nervously at the security guard and then pulled me slightly to the side. He lowered his voice to a frantic whisper. He told me that Roland Hayes had called the managing partners at 3 a.m. Roland is the lead developer for the firm's largest commercial real estate clients. He controls 40% of our auditing portfolio. Greg said Roland threatened to pull every single contract and bankrupt the firm if I was not removed from the building before 8 a.m. I tried to reason with Greg. I told him I was the lead accountant on 3 major accounts. I told him my son was waiting in the car and we had nowhere to go. Greg shook his head slowly. He told me it was worse than just a termination. Roland had already made phone calls to the senior partners at the top 4 accounting firms in the city. He fabricated a story that I was under internal investigation for embezzling client funds. He branded me a liability. Greg looked at me with a mixture of pity and terror. He said my career in Chicago was over. He told me no reputable firm would ever hire me because Roland had made me radioactive. He turned his back and walked quickly toward the elevators. The security guard placed his hand on the small of my back and shoved me toward the revolving glass doors. I stumbled out onto the wet sidewalk, clutching the cardboard box of my useless belongings. I had walked into the building as a respected professional. Less than 5 minutes later, I was thrown out onto the street like a common criminal. The freezing rain was coming down harder now. I stood on the sidewalk trying to process the magnitude of what Roland had just done. He did not just use his power to hurt me. He used it to completely erase my professional existence. But I still had my bank accounts. Camille and I had a joint savings account with nearly $240,000 in it. Half of that money was my own salary saved meticulously over a decade. I left the box on a public bench and jogged down the block to an outdoor banking machine. My hands were shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. I slid my debit card into the machine and punched in my PIN code. I pressed the button to withdraw $1,000. I waited for the familiar sound of the cash dispenser. Instead, the screen froze for 3 seconds. A loud beep sounded. A bright red error message flashed across the screen. Transaction declined. Insufficient funds. I thought it was a network error. I wiped the rain off my face and tried again. I requested $500. The machine beeped again. Transaction declined. I felt a cold knot of pure panic form in my stomach. I hit the button to check my total account balance. A small paper receipt printed out and fluttered in the wind. I snatched it and stared at the bold black ink. The available balance in my joint savings account was $0.00. I stared at the paper, unable to comprehend the numbers. My breathing turned shallow. I tried my secondary personal checking account, the one that only had my name on it. The screen flashed a different message. Account restricted. Please contact your branch administrator. I pulled my card out and ran toward the main bank branch 3 blocks away. My lungs burned as I sprinted through the financial district. I burst through the heavy glass doors of the bank, dripping wet and breathing hard. The security guard eyed me suspiciously. I walked straight up to the teller counter and slammed my debit card down. I demanded to know why my money was gone and why my personal account was locked. The teller typed my information into her computer. Her eyes widened. She immediately picked up her phone and dialed a supervisor. 2 minutes later, the branch manager stepped out of a private glass office. She was a stern woman in a gray suit. She asked me to step inside her office and close the door. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk. I demanded my money. I told her I had a 10-year-old son waiting in a freezing car and I needed to pay for a hotel. The manager looked at her screen with a tight, rigid expression. She informed me that at 6 o'clock this morning, my wife Camille had executed a series of massive wire transfers. A wire transfer of that magnitude at 6 in the morning requires a private banker to override the security protocols. Roland had clearly placed a call to a banking executive the moment he left my house. The speed and efficiency of the theft were staggering. Because Camille was a legal co-owner of the joint account, she had the absolute right to drain the entire $240,000. She moved every single penny into an offshore trust controlled by her father, Roland Hayes. The money was gone. It was perfectly legal and totally irretrievable. I slammed my hands on the desk. I told the manager that was theft. I told her Camille was trying to ruin me because of her father, but the manager held up a hand to stop me. She pulled a printed legal document from a fax tray behind her desk and slid it across the table. She told me the situation was much worse than a drained savings account. She pointed to a stamped signature at the bottom of the page. It was a temporary restraining order issued by a prominent family court judge. Camille and her high-priced lawyers had filed an emergency injunction claiming I was a violent threat. They filed fabricated reports stating I had physically attacked her father and was planning to flee the state with stolen funds. The branch manager explained that the restraining order included a financial freeze on all my personal assets. My individual checking account, my retirement funds, and even my emergency credit lines were locked by a federal court order pending a domestic dispute investigation. The legal jargon was a tangled web of lies designed to paralyze me completely. I begged her. I pleaded with her to just let me withdraw a few $100s of my own money to feed my son. She looked at me with cold, bureaucratic indifference. She told me her hands were tied. She said if I attempted to access the funds again, the bank would be legally obligated to call the police and report a violation of a court order. She stood up and opened her office door, signaling that our conversation was over. I walked out of the bank. The reality of the financial guillotine crashed down on my shoulders. Roland Hayes was not just punishing me for protecting my son. He was orchestrating a systematic total destruction of my ability to survive. He knew exactly what he was doing. He used his business contracts to sever my income. He used his daughter to drain my cash. He used his lawyers to weaponize the court system against me. He had built a massive invisible cage around me in less than 12 hours. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me starving. He wanted me to crawl back to his mansion on my hands and knees and hand over my son just to get a scrap of bread. I walked slowly back to where I had parked my car. The rain was freezing against my skin, but I could hardly feel it. I reached the car and looked through the passenger window. Leo was sitting there exactly where I left him. His small face was pale. He looked terrified. He was holding an empty plastic water bottle and staring at me with wide, hopeful eyes. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. I did not speak. I pulled my leather wallet from my back pocket. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside, there was a single $100 bill and two $20 bills. $140. That was the absolute sum total of my net worth in the world. I stared at the paper money. $140 to fight a billionaire who owned politicians and judges. $140 to protect the only person in the world who mattered to me. Roland had used his extreme wealth as a weapon to starve me into submission. He thought poverty would break my mind. He thought removing my comfort would shatter my will to fight. But sitting in that freezing car, looking at my bruised and shivering son, the despair burned away. It was replaced by a cold mechanical focus. The system was rigged against me. The rules of society had been bought and paid for by men like Roland Hayes. But my mind was still my own. My forensic ability to track a lie was still intact. I shoved the cash back into my pocket and put the car in drive. We were completely broken. We were entirely alone. But I was not going to surrender. I pulled the car onto Interstate 94, heading south away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. The Chicago skyline faded into the rearview mirror, swallowed by the heavy gray storm clouds. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the roof of the car with a deafening roar. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. Beside me in the passenger seat, Leo sat completely silent. He was staring out the window at the blurred headlights of passing trucks. He looked so small, wrapped in his damp winter coat. My heart shattered every time I glanced at the dark purple bruises forming around his neck. We needed a place to hide. I could not use a credit card because Camille had frozen my accounts. I had exactly $140 in my pocket. Every mile we drove took us further away from the illusion of the wealthy life I had lived for 12 years. I took an exit near the industrial shipping yards where the streetlights flickered and the roads were lined with abandoned warehouses. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a rundown cash-only motel. The neon sign above the office was missing half its letters. I told Leo to lock the doors and stay low in the seat. I ran through the freezing rain into the motel lobby. The air inside smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine disinfectant. A tired-looking clerk sat behind a thick pane of scratched, bulletproof glass. I asked for a room for one night. He looked at my soaked dress shirt and the desperate expression on my face. He told me it was $50 cash up front, no refunds. I pulled the single $100 bill from my wallet and slid it under the metal tray. He handed me back a single $50 bill and a brass key attached to a heavy plastic tag. I had $90 left to my name. I drove the car around to the back of the building and parked in front of room 112. I grabbed our single duffel bag and hurried Leo through the rain. When I pushed the door open, the smell of mildew and damp carpet hit me like a physical blow. I flicked the light switch. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. There were two sagging beds covered in faded floral bedspreads. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, revealing dark patches of mold. The curtains were stained and hung unevenly over a small barred window. Just 12 hours ago, I had been standing in a custom-built walk-in closet made of imported mahogany. Camille and I slept on a mattress that cost more than some people earn in a year. We walked on heated marble floors. Now I was standing in a filthy roadside motel room, watching my 10-year-old son shiver as he sat on the edge of a stained bed. This was the stark, brutal reality of survival. Roland Hayes had not just kicked me out of his house. He had thrown me into an entirely different world to show me exactly how helpless I was without his money. I tried to put on a brave face for Leo. I told him we were just having a camping adventure for the night. I took off his wet coat and wrapped him in one of the scratchy motel blankets. I told him to pick a bed and claim his territory. He tried to smile, but his eyes were filled with a deep, lingering terror. He asked me if his grandfather knew where we were. He asked if Roland was coming to find us. I sat down next to him and held his hands. I promised him that no one knew we were here, and that I would never let that man near him again. I walked down the exterior corridor to a humming vending machine enclosed in a metal cage. I spent $3 on a bag of pretzels and 2 bottles of water. That was our dinner. I brought it back to the room and watched Leo quietly eat. Every time he swallowed, I could see him wince in pain from his bruised throat. The sight of it made my blood boil, but I had to swallow my anger. I had to figure out a plan. I turned on the old television, bolting it to a low volume so the sound of cartoons could fill the heavy silence of the room. Then my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an unknown Chicago number. For a brief, foolish second, I thought it might be Camille. I thought maybe her maternal instinct had finally broken through the greed. I thought maybe she was calling to ask if Leo was safe. I swiped the screen and answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear. "Mr. Lincoln," a voice said. It was not Camille. It was a man with a smooth, perfectly modulated baritone voice. It was the kind of voice that commanded boardrooms and destroyed lives without ever raising its volume. "My name is Thomas Sterling," the voice continued. "I am the senior partner at Sterling & Associates representing your wife, Camille Lincoln. I am calling to inform you of the legal actions currently being executed against you." I walked away from the beds and stood in the corner of the room, keeping my voice low so Leo would not hear. I told Mr. Sterling that he had no right to speak to me and that I wanted to talk to my wife. Mr. Sterling chuckled softly, a cold, dismissive sound. "You will not be speaking to Camille tonight, Mr. Lincoln, or ever again unless it is through my office. Camille has officially filed for full and sole legal custody of your son Leo. Furthermore, we have filed an emergency petition to terminate your parental rights entirely." The words felt like a physical punch to my chest. I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers went numb. I told him he was insane. I told him Camille had no grounds to take my son. I said I was the one protecting Leo from her father who had literally choked him against a wall. Mr. Sterling let out a long, patient sigh as if he were explaining a simple concept to a very slow child. "That is a fascinating narrative, Mr. Lincoln. Unfortunately for you, the sworn affidavits we have collected tell a very different story. We have a sworn deposition from Roland Hayes stating that you attacked him unprovoked in his own home, attempting to extort him for gambling money. We have a sworn deposition from Camille stating you have a history of erratic, violent behavior. And we have a highly detailed statement from your sister-in-law, Chloe, testifying that she witnessed you screaming at your family and threatening physical harm before you abducted the child." I felt the room start to spin. They had built an airtight cage of lies around me. Chloe had never liked me, but to actively participate in a plot to steal my son was a level of evil I had not anticipated. She was a wealthy, elite white woman with a pristine social reputation. If she sat on a witness stand and cried while telling a judge that I was a violent, unpredictable man, the court would believe her without hesitation. "You cannot do this," I whispered, my voice shaking with pure panic. "It is a lie. The bruises on Leo are from Roland. A doctor can prove it." Mr. Sterling cut me off with terrifying precision. "Any marks on the boy will be easily attributed to your violent abduction of him this afternoon. Let me be perfectly clear about your current situation, Mr. Lincoln. You are unemployed. You have been terminated for suspected embezzlement. Your personal assets are entirely frozen under a federal restraining order. You do not have the financial resources to hire a paralegal, let alone fight the most powerful family law firm in the state of Illinois." He paused, letting the absolute reality of my poverty sink in. "If you attempt to bring this to court, we will bury you," Mr. Sterling said. "We will drag your name through the mud until you are unemployable in any industry. We will ensure the local district attorney pursues criminal assault charges against you for your attack on Roland Hayes. You will go to a state penitentiary. However, my client is willing to be merciful. If you sign the surrender of your parental rights tomorrow morning, we will drop the criminal charges. You can walk away and start a new life somewhere else." He was giving me an ultimatum. Give up my son or go to prison. Roland was using his immense wealth to buy the truth, to buy the law, and to buy my child. "I will never give him up," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I will die before I let Roland near him again." "Have it your way, Mr. Lincoln. We will see you in court, assuming you can afford the bus fare to get there." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The dial tone echoed in the small, filthy room. I looked over at the bed. Leo had fallen asleep, his small chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket. The flickering neon light from the parking lot cast long shadows across his bruised neck. I told myself I had to be strong. I told myself I had to think like an accountant to calculate the variables and find a solution. But the numbers did not add up. The ledger of my life was completely unbalanced. I had $90. They had millions. I had the truth. They had the power to rewrite reality. I walked into the tiny, moldy bathroom and shut the hollow wooden door behind me. I turned the handle on the sink, letting the lukewarm water run at full pressure so Leo would not hear me. I gripped the edges of the chipped porcelain sink and leaned over, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror above. My dress shirt was soaked with freezing rain and sweat. My eyes were bloodshot and wide with terror. I looked exactly like the pathetic, worthless loser Chloe had always claimed I was. The sheer weight of what I was facing came crashing down on me all at once. Roland had expertly severed every single lifeline I possessed. He had taken my career. He had taken my life savings. He had taken my wife. Now he was using the justice system to legally kidnap my son and throw me in a prison cell. I was completely outgunned. I was entirely outfinanced. I slid down the bathroom wall until I hit the cold, damp linoleum floor. I pulled my knees to my chest and buried my face in my hands. The tears came fast and hard. I could not stop them. My chest heaved with violent, silent sobs. I felt like I was suffocating under the immense pressure of their power. I thought about the 12 years I had spent trying to prove myself to the Hayes family. I had worked 50 hours a week. I had worn the suits they bought me. I had attended their charity galas and smiled at their condescending friends. I had swallowed every insult and every backhanded compliment just to keep the peace. And for what? For them to discard me like a piece of garbage the moment I tried to protect my own flesh and blood. I felt a crushing sense of worthlessness. Roland was right. I was a ghost. I had no power. If I went to the police, they would laugh at me. If I went to a judge, they would look at my empty bank account and brand me a violent risk. They were going to take Leo away from me. They were going to hand him over to a billionaire monster who choked children for sport. I sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes, letting the despair wash over me. I wanted to give up. I wanted to tell Mr. Sterling I would sign the papers just to make the nightmare stop. The pain of losing everything in a single day was too much for one man to carry. I wiped my eyes with the back of my wet sleeve. I reached into the pocket of my soaked trousers to grab a tissue. My fingers brushed against something hard and cold. I pulled my hand out of my pocket. Resting in my palm was the small rusted brass key with the number 407 stamped on the side. The key Leo had picked up from the floor of the study. The key that had made Roland Hayes lose his mind. I sat there staring at the piece of old metal under the flickering fluorescent bathroom light. The tears stopped. The panic slowly began to recede, replaced by the cold, calculating logic of a forensic accountant. Roland Hayes had infinite wealth and power. But he had a secret he was terrified of. A secret hidden behind a false wall and locked away in an analog box. He thought I was completely broken. He thought I was sitting in a motel room feeling sorry for myself, waiting for his lawyers to finish me off. He had miscalculated. He had stripped away my illusions and left me with nothing but the brutal reality of survival. And in the reality of survival, a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous piece on the board. Sitting on the cold linoleum floor of that filthy motel bathroom, I felt the absolute weight of my failure. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I had allowed Roland Hayes to completely dismantle my life in a matter of hours. The silence in the room was only broken by the sound of the leaky faucet dripping into the stained sink. I wanted to stay on that floor. I wanted to surrender to the exhaustion and the fear. But then I heard a small sound coming from the other side of the thin wooden door. It was a soft, hesitant knock. Dad. The voice was so quiet, I almost missed it. It was Leo. My 10-year-old son was standing on the other side of that door, waiting for me. He had just been choked by his own grandfather. He had just watched his mother abandon him. He had been dragged out into a freezing storm and brought to a decaying motel. He had every right to be crying. He had every right to be terrified. But he was not crying. He was checking on me. I wiped my face with the back of my damp sleeve. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stand up. I opened the door. Leo was standing there, wrapped in the scratchy floral bedspread. His dark eyes looked up at me. He saw the red in my eyes. He knew I had been crying, but he did not judge me. He just reached out and took my hand. "I am okay, Dad," he said softly. Hearing him say that broke my heart all over again. I dropped to one knee so I was at his eye level. I squeezed his hand and told him how sorry I was. I told him I was sorry for the motel. I told him I was sorry for what his mother had done. I told him I was sorry I could not protect him better. Leo shook his head. He looked over his shoulder toward the door of the motel room, making sure the deadbolt was locked. Then he looked back at me with a seriousness that did not belong on the face of a 10-year-old boy. "You do not need to be sorry, Dad. Grandpa is a bad man. Mom is just like him. But we are not like them." I swallowed hard. I nodded and told him he was absolutely right. We were not like them. I told him we were going to figure this out. I told him I just needed a little bit of time to come up with a plan to beat them. Leo let go of my hand. He reached deep into the front pocket of his damp jeans. He looked at the bathroom door, and then he looked at me. "I already have a plan," he whispered. He pulled his hand out of his pocket and slowly opened his fingers. Resting right in the middle of his small palm was the heavy, rusted brass key. The same key I had seen him holding in the study. The key that had caused Roland Hayes to lose his mind and attack his own blood. I stared at it. I had completely forgotten about the key in the chaos of the eviction, the bank freeze, and the phone call from the lawyers. I reached out and carefully picked it up. It felt ice cold against my skin. "Tell me exactly what happened, Leo," I said, my voice dropping to a low, serious whisper. "Tell me everything you saw in that study before I walked in. Do not leave anything out." Leo took a deep breath. His voice trembled slightly as he recalled the memory, but he stood his ground. "I was looking for my math book," he began. "I thought I left it on the big leather chair in the study. The door was open a little bit. When I pushed it, Grandpa was standing facing the wall. Not the regular wall. The wall with all the old books on it. He pushed a button under the bottom shelf and a whole piece of the wood just popped open. It was like a secret door. My forensic accounting mind snapped into high gear. Roland Hayes did not read books. His study was entirely for show. A false panel in a mahogany bookshelf was something out of a cheap spy movie. But Roland was a man obsessed with control. He would never trust a bank vault with his darkest secrets. He would keep them exactly where he could see them every single day. "What was inside the secret door?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked on Leo. Leo swallowed hard. "Just a dark hole. But Grandpa was putting something inside it. It was a really thick black book. It looked like one of those old notebooks you use for your work, Dad. The ones with the lines inside. A ledger. Roland was hiding a physical handwritten ledger. In an era of digital banking, offshore wire transfers, and encrypted hard drives, a billionaire was hiding a physical ledger behind a false wall. That meant whatever was in that book could never be digitized. It was too dangerous to touch a computer network. As he was pushing the thick black book into the hole, Leo continued, his voice shaking a little more now. Something fell out of the pages. It hit the wooden floor and made a loud ringing sound. Grandpa cursed. He turned around to pick it up, but I was closer. I saw it shining on the rug. I just reached down and grabbed it. I did not know what it was. I just wanted to see it. I closed my eyes, picturing the scene. A 10-year-old boy full of innocent curiosity picking up a dropped key. When Grandpa saw me holding it, Leo whispered, a tear finally spilling over his eyelashes. His whole face changed. He looked like a monster dad. He lunged at me. He grabbed my neck and slammed me into the books. He told me if I told anyone about the secret wall or the black book, I would disappear forever. He was squeezing so hard I could not breathe. And then you came in. I pulled Leo into my arms and hugged him tightly. I told him he was safe. I told him he was so incredibly brave. I held him until his shaking stopped. Then I stood up and walked over to the small desk in the corner of the motel room. I turned on the cheap plastic desk lamp. I held the rusted key directly under the light. I needed to see every single detail. I am an accountant. My entire career is built on finding the story hidden inside the smallest details. A missing decimal point can reveal $1 million fraud. A single rusted key could reveal the destruction of a billionaire. The key was heavy. It was made of solid brass, but the edges were deeply corroded with green and brown rust. This was not a key to a modern safe. This was not a key to a luxury car or a high-tech security door. This was old. It felt like it belonged to another century. I rubbed my thumb over the top of the key. There were numbers stamped deeply into the metal. 407. It was a box number. I flipped the key over. The back side was scratched and worn down from decades of neglect. But right in the center, stamped into the brass, was a very faint logo. I squinted, bringing the key closer to the bulb. It was the outline of an oak tree surrounded by a circle of stars. Beneath the tree were 3 letters heavily faded by time and rust. OMB. I pulled my laptop out of my duffel bag. I plugged it into the wall outlet and connected to the unsecured motel internet network. I opened a search engine. I typed in the letters OMB, along with the words Bank Oak Tree logo. I hit enter. The screen loaded a series of archived financial articles from the early 1990s. I clicked on the first link. It was a business directory for rural banking institutions in the Midwest. I scrolled down the page until I saw the exact logo stamped on the key. Oakmont Mercantile Bank. It was a tiny independent credit union located in a small rural town in Indiana. The town was called Blackwood. It was located exactly 200 miles away from the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. I leaned back in the plastic desk chair. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to lock together in my mind. Roland Hayes was a man who operated exclusively in the highest echelons of global finance. He dealt with massive investment firms, Swiss bankers, and Cayman Island trust funds. He wore $5,000 suits and drank $1,000 bottles of wine. He would never in his life step foot inside a tiny rural credit union in a dusty town in Indiana, unless he needed to hide something that could destroy him. Rich men are predictable. When they commit fraud, they use complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts. They hide their money behind layers of corporate lawyers and international borders. But when they commit a crime so severe that it could unravel their entire existence, they do not trust lawyers. They do not trust computers. They go backward. They find a place so small, so insignificant, and so far off the radar that no federal investigator would ever think to look there. Oakmont Mercantile Bank in Blackwood, Indiana, was exactly that kind of place. I looked down at the key. It was a safety deposit box key. Roland was keeping a master ledger in his study. The ledger was the map, but this key was the actual destination. Whatever was sitting inside Box 407 in that rural Indiana bank vault was the foundation of the Hayes family empire. It was the absolute source of his wealth. And because he was willing to murder his own grandson to get this key back, I knew the contents of that box were entirely illegal. My forensic instincts were screaming at me. Roland had frozen my bank accounts. He had terminated my career. He had mobilized a team of ruthless lawyers to steal my son and put me in prison. If I stayed in Chicago, I would be fighting a war on his battlefield. He owned the judges. He owned the police. He owned the narrative. If I went to family court on Monday morning, I would lose. I would be destroyed. I could not fight him with lawyers. I could not fight him with money. I had to fight him with the truth. I had to rip the foundation out from under his feet before he could drop the guillotine on my neck. I pulled my wallet out of my pocket. I counted the bills again. I had spent $50 on the room and $3 on snacks. I had $87 left to my name. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. It was 3:15 in the morning. I turned to Leo. He was watching me from the bed, his dark eyes wide and alert. He could see the change in my posture. He could see the despair leaving my body. "Get your shoes on, Leo," I said, my voice firm and steady. "Grab your coat. We are leaving." "Where are we going, Dad?" he asked, slipping his small arms into his damp winter jacket. "We are going to Indiana," I replied. "We are going to find out exactly what your grandfather is hiding." We walked out of the motel room into the freezing rain. The storm had not let up. The wind whipped across the dark parking lot, rattling the broken neon sign. We got into the car. I knew I could not drive my old sedan to Indiana. The transmission was slipping. The tires were bald, and I did not have enough money for a full tank of gas and emergency repairs if we broke down on the highway. Roland's private investigators would also be looking for my license plate. I needed to move off the grid. I needed to be a ghost. I drove the car to a massive 24-hour discount superstore a few miles away. I parked it in the darkest corner of the vast empty lot and left the keys under the floor mat. We walked through the rain to a public bus stop on the corner. We stood under the small plexiglass shelter, shivering as cars splashed through the deep puddles in the street. At 4 in the morning, a city bus arrived. We rode it in silence all the way to the Greyhound terminal downtown. The terminal was a bleak, depressing cavern of fluorescent lights and exhausted travelers. It smelled of diesel fuel, wet wool, and stale coffee. People were sleeping on the hard plastic benches, clutching their cheap luggage. Just yesterday, I was auditing million-dollar corporate tax returns. Now I was standing in a dirty bus terminal with the rest of the forgotten people. But I did not feel defeated. I felt dangerous. I walked up to the ticket counter. A tired woman with a name tag pinned to her uniform looked up at me without any expression. I asked her for 2 one-way tickets to Blackwood, Indiana, on the next available bus. She typed on her keyboard. "That will be exactly $40 for the adult and $20 for the child," she said, popping her chewing gum. $60 total. Leaves at 5:15. Boarding at gate 4. I pulled out my remaining cash. I handed her the $50 bill and a $20. She handed me back $10 and 2 paper tickets. I had $27 left in the entire world. I took the tickets and walked over to where Leo was sitting on a plastic bench. I sat down next to him and handed him a bottle of water. He took a sip and leaned his head against my arm. He was so incredibly tired. His small body was shivering from the damp clothes. I put my arm around him and pulled him close, sharing my body heat. We waited for an hour in the cold, drafty terminal. Every time the heavy doors opened, I watched closely, making sure no one in a suit was walking in to find us. Roland Hayes thought he had me completely trapped. He thought he had severed every possible avenue of escape. He assumed I would be sitting in a cheap motel calling legal aid clinics begging for mercy. He never imagined that the accountant he despised was currently holding the only key to his hidden kingdom. He never imagined that a 10-year-old boy had outsmarted him. At 5:10, the loud overhead speaker cracked to life. The automated voice announced the departure for the southbound bus to Indiana. I stood up and hoisted our duffel bag over my shoulder. I looked down at my son. "Ready?" I asked. Leo nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. He reached up and took my hand. His grip was strong. We walked out through the sliding glass doors toward the massive silver bus idling in the rain. The smell of exhaust filled the heavy morning air. The driver checked our paper tickets and nodded toward the dark interior of the bus. We climbed the steps and found 2 empty seats near the back. The engine roared to life. The doors hissed shut. The bus slowly pulled out of the terminal, merging onto the dark, wet highway leading out of Chicago. I watched the towering glass and steel skyline of the city fade into the distance. Behind those glowing windows, men like Roland Hayes were sleeping comfortably in their silk sheets, believing they owned the world, believing they could crush anyone who got in their way. I leaned my head against the cold glass window. I slipped my hand into my pocket and closed my fingers around the rusted brass key. The metal was warming up against my skin. I did not have a job. I did not have a home. I did not have a wife. I was riding a cheap bus into the middle of nowhere with $27 in my pocket. But I was not a victim anymore. I was a forensic accountant on the trail of a massive fraud. Roland Hayes had brought a billionaire's arrogance to a knife fight, and I was about to use this piece of rusted junk to cut his empire right down to the bone. The Greyhound bus pulled into the terminal at Blackwood, Indiana, just as the pale morning sun tried to push through the heavy gray clouds. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was biting cold. I held Leo by the hand as we stepped off the bus onto the cracked concrete platform. My legs were stiff and my stomach was completely empty. We had exactly $27 left to our name. We were standing in a town that looked like it had been entirely forgotten by time. There were no glass skyscrapers here. There were no men in custom-tailored suits holding expensive coffees. There were just empty storefronts, faded brick buildings, and a quiet, heavy desperation that hung in the cold morning air. I looked down at my son. Leo was exhausted. His dark eyes were heavy with lack of sleep, and the dark bruises on his neck were a brutal reminder of why we were running. But he did not complain. He just squeezed my hand and looked up at me, trusting me completely. That silent, absolute trust was the only thing keeping me on my feet. I promised him we were going to find the answers we needed. I pulled the rusted brass key from my pocket. I rubbed my thumb over the stamped number 407. I scanned the quiet main street, looking for the old oak tree logo I had found online during the middle of the night. We walked for 4 long blocks down the empty sidewalk. The town was eerily silent. Finally, at the corner of Main Street and Elm Avenue, I saw it. Oakmont Mercantile Bank. It was a small, single-story brick building. It looked more like an abandoned post office from the 1970s than a functioning financial institution. The paint on the heavy wooden front door was peeling away in thick strips. The gold lettering on the front window was chipped and fading. Roland Hayes was a man who demanded imported marble lobbies and private, secure elevator banks. The fact that he held a safety deposit box in this decaying rural credit union 200 miles away from Chicago told me everything I needed to know. He was hiding a monster in the dark. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. A small brass bell chimed weakly above our heads. The interior of the bank smelled like lemon polish and decades of old paper. There was no armed security guard at the door. There were no velvet ropes or digital screens. There was just a single teller working behind a thick glass partition and a middle-aged man sitting at a scarred wooden desk in the back corner of the room. He wore a cheap gray suit and thick wire-rimmed glasses. A small brass nameplate on his desk read, "Branch Manager." I walked straight up to his desk, keeping Leo close by my side. I did not look like a man who belonged in a bank. My dress shirt was wrinkled and deeply stained with dried rainwater. I had not shaved. I looked like a desperate drifter who had just spent the night shivering on the street. The manager looked up from his stack of paperwork and frowned immediately. He clearly wanted to ask me to leave the premises, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I placed the rusted brass key flat on the center of his wooden desk. I kept my voice incredibly calm and authoritative. I am a forensic accountant, and I have spent my entire career learning how to project absolute confidence in rooms where I have zero power. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I needed immediate access to box number 407. The manager stared down at the rusted key. He adjusted his glasses and looked back up at me with clear suspicion. He told me that specific box had not been accessed in over a decade. He said he needed to see my government identification and the corporate authorization paperwork before we could proceed. I felt my heart drop straight into my stomach. I did not have any corporate paperwork. I only had the key my son had picked up off the floor, but I could not let this man see a single ounce of panic. I leaned over his desk, planting my hands firmly on the wood. I told him I was conducting an emergency forensic audit for the primary shareholder. I fabricated a story on the spot saying the original corporate documents were destroyed in a severe flood, and the contents of that specific box were the only physical legal records left in existence. I told him if he delayed my access by even 1 minute, he would be personally legally responsible for obstructing a multi-million-dollar federal audit. It was a complete and total bluff. I was betting my entire life on the hope that a small-town rural bank manager would be too intimidated by corporate buzzwords and legal threats to verify my story. He hesitated. He looked down at the key again. He typed something slowly into his old computer terminal. The green text reflected brightly on his glasses. He swallowed hard and cleared his throat. He told me the box was originally opened in 1994. He said it was registered under a private shell company called Apex Holdings Group. He looked closely at his computer screen and told me there was no individual human name attached to the account anywhere in their system. It was set up under a strict bearer key protocol. That meant whoever held the physical brass key had the absolute legal right to open the box, no questions asked. Roland Hayes had been so incredibly arrogant, so absolutely certain that no one would ever find his secret false wall that he used a bearer key system just to keep his own name off the rural bank registry. It was a massive, fatal miscalculation. The manager stood up with a heavy sigh. He grabbed a heavy ring of master keys from his top drawer. He told me to follow him. He led Leo and me down a short, narrow hallway into the back of the building. We stopped in front of a massive, heavy steel vault door. The manager spun a combination dial rapidly and pulled the heavy metal lever downward. The vault door groaned loudly as it swung open. The air inside was freezing cold and smelled like iron rust and stale dust. The vault was surprisingly small. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with rows of rectangular metal boxes. The manager walked down the second aisle and stopped in front of a box near the bottom row. It had the number 407 painted in faded, peeling white letters. He inserted his long master key into the left lock and turned it until it clicked. He pulled his key out, stepped back, and gestured for me to use my key. My hand was shaking violently as I knelt down on the cold tile floor. I put the rusted brass key into the right side lock. I turned it slowly. A loud, heavy click echoed in the quiet vault. The manager pulled the long metal drawer out of the wall and handed it down to me. He told me there was a private viewing room right outside the vault doors. He said I could take all the time I needed to review the files. I carried the heavy metal box into the small, windowless viewing room and set it down on the scratched wooden table in the center. Leo stood right next to me, holding tightly onto my arm. He looked up at me with his big, dark eyes. He asked me if the things inside the box were going to save us from his grandfather. I looked down at him and told him I truly hoped so. I took a deep, steadying breath. I lifted the heavy metal lid of the box and pushed it back. I was expecting a massive revelation. I was expecting neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills to fund our escape. I was expecting bearer bonds, offshore account routing numbers, or a digital hard drive containing encrypted blackmail files. I thought I was going to find a clear, undeniable weapon that I could point directly at Roland Hayes to force him to leave my family alone. Instead, I looked down into the metal tin and saw a pile of garbage. There was absolutely no money. There was no gold. There were no digital files of any kind. The box was completely filled with a disorganized, messy pile of severely water-damaged paper. The edges of the documents were yellowed, brittle, and curling inward. A faint, sickening smell of mold drifted up from the open box. I stared at the pile of trash and felt all the air leave my lungs. A crushing wave of despair hit me so hard my knees went weak. I had dragged my 10-year-old bruised son through a freezing midnight storm. I had spent my absolute last dollars on a dirty bus ticket. I had risked immediate arrest by bluffing a bank manager. I did all of it for a box of rotting, useless paper. I reached into the metal tin and pulled out the top stack of documents. The paper felt powdery and incredibly fragile in my hands. I spread the pages out across the wooden table under the harsh fluorescent light. They were property deeds. I looked at the official stamp dates at the top of the pages. 1991, 1992, 1994. I reached back into the box and pulled out another thick stack. They were property tax ledgers from Cook County, Illinois. The blue ink was faded and smeared heavily in places, making the numbers hard to read. At the very bottom of the box, sitting alone beneath a pile of old bank statements, was a single faded birth certificate. I put my hands flat on the table and let my head drop forward in defeat. We were completely finished. I had nothing to use against him. Roland had won the game. He was probably sitting in his warm Chicago mansion laughing right now, knowing I was chasing completely empty ghosts in rural Indiana. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek. I had failed my son. We were going to end up begging on the street exactly like Camille promised we would, Dad Leo whispered. He tugged gently on my wet sleeve. Why did Grandpa choke me for this old paper? I froze completely. Leo was just a kid, but his pure, simple logic was absolutely correct. Roland Hayes was a ruthless, calculating, sociopathic billionaire. He did not lose his temper over meaningless garbage. He did not risk a felony murder charge over worthless pieces of rotting paper. If he went through the trouble of hiding these specific documents behind a custom false wall in a secret ledger and kept the only key in a rural bank vault 200 miles away, these papers were not garbage. They were highly lethal. I stood up straight. I wiped my eyes aggressively and forced myself to stop acting like a defeated victim. I was a forensic accountant. My entire professional life was built on reading the hidden stories that numbers and legal documents told. I pulled my glasses out of my pocket and leaned over the table. I began to read the water-damaged deeds one by one, analyzing every single line of text. I looked at the property addresses listed on the yellowed paper. My heart skipped a heavy beat. I recognized the street names instantly. I recognized the specific zip codes. These were not random abandoned plots of land. These were the exact locations of the most valuable commercial real estate in the entire South Loop of Chicago. This was the exact land where Roland Hayes had built his massive glowing glass skyscrapers. This land was the absolute foundation of his $100 million real estate empire. But as I read the names of the property owners listed on the original deeds, the mystery deepened into something truly horrifying. The names on the original deeds did not belong to Roland Hayes. They did not belong to Camille or anyone in her elite family. They did not belong to Apex Holdings Group. They belonged to people I had never heard of before. I read the names out loud softly into the quiet room. Calvin Reynolds, Beatrice Hughes, Jerome Wallace, Simone Carter. Every single piece of prime real estate was registered to a completely different person. I grabbed the 1990s tax ledgers and rapidly cross-referenced the names from the deeds. My hands began to shake violently as the numbers clearly revealed the awful truth. These names belonged to elderly, marginalized black families living in Chicago during the early 90s. These were hard-working, normal people who owned their family homes free and clear. I checked the columns. They had paid their mortgages in full. They had paid their property taxes on time. The ledgers proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single one of these families was in perfect financial standing with the city. But attached to the back of each and every deed was a heavy legal notice of default and immediate foreclosure. The signatures on the foreclosure documents were entirely uniform. They were all signed and authorized by a single private debt collection agency. I checked the corporate registry stamp at the bottom of the page. The agency was a direct subsidiary of Apex Holdings Group. Roland Hayes was the sole owner of the shell company. The air in the small viewing room suddenly felt freezing cold against my skin. I was staring at the undeniable proof of a massive systematic extortion plot. Roland Hayes did not build his incredible real estate empire through smart investments and hard work. He built it through absolute predatory theft. In the early 90s, he used his anonymous shell company to completely fabricate fraudulent tax debts and fake mortgage defaults against marginalized elderly families. He targeted people who did not have the money, the legal connections, or the power to fight back in a corrupt court system. He systematically stole their generational wealth right out from under them. He forged the chain of title, he brutally evicted them from their homes, and he demolished their entire neighborhoods to build his luxury high-rises. This was not just standard white-collar crime. This was the ruthless, intentional destruction of dozens of innocent families. If these specific documents ever saw the light of a federal courtroom, Roland would not just lose his money and his status. He would face dozens of federal racketeering and grand larceny charges. His entire empire would be immediately seized by the government to pay restitution to the families he destroyed. He would absolutely die in a federal penitentiary. No wonder he was willing to kill his own 10-year-old grandson to keep this key a secret. This metal box was his personal graveyard. I looked at the stack of stolen deeds. I felt a burning righteous anger rising in my chest, hot and fast. For 12 years, Roland had treated me like dirt because I was not born into wealth. He called me a parasite in my own home. He told me I was a ghost. He paraded his $100 million net worth around the city, demanding absolute respect and crushing anyone who dared to question him. But his entire life, his entire legacy was a complete fabrication. He was nothing but a violent thief wearing a custom suit. I picked up the final document resting at the bottom of the pile, the faded birth certificate. The edges were crumbling and the black ink was barely legible under the lights. I brought it close to my face and read the names printed carefully on the fragile paper. All the breath left my lungs in a violent, sudden rush. My knees went entirely weak. I had to grab the edge of the wooden table with both hands just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I stared at the name of the mother listed on the birth certificate. Then I stared at the name of the child. The name of the child was Andre Lincoln. It was my birth certificate. My mind raced backward, tearing through decades of deeply buried memories. My family had always been incredibly poor. I grew up in a tiny, cramped, rented apartment on the south side of Chicago. My father died when I was very young, and my mother worked 3 exhausting jobs just to keep basic food on the table. She always told me we used to have a beautiful, spacious house when I was a baby, but we lost it to the bank during a bad financial year. She died thinking she had failed me as a mother. She died thinking it was her own fault that we lost everything we had. I frantically searched through the pile of water-damaged property deeds, throwing papers aside until I found it. I pulled out the deed that matched the exact street address printed on my birth certificate. I looked at the foreclosure notice brutally stapled to the back of it. The signature on the eviction order belonged to Apex Holdings Group. Roland Hayes did not just steal from strangers in the night. He stole directly from my family. He stole the very house I was born in. He stole the generational wealth that my hard-working grandfather had spent his entire life trying to build for us. Roland took our land, demolished our family home, and built the massive, towering Hayes Commercial Plaza directly on top of it. He intentionally forced my mother into a life of grinding poverty while he became a billionaire using our stolen foundation. And then 12 years ago, he smiled to my face and gave me his blessing to marry his daughter. He watched me struggle to pay bills. He mocked my meager accounting salary at family dinners. He allowed his daughter and his elite sister-in-law to treat me like a rat crawling through their pristine halls. He did all of it while he was sitting on top of an empire that legally and rightfully belonged to me. I stared at the scattered papers on the table. I was no longer just a desperate forensic accountant looking at a stranger's massive fraud. I was a man looking directly at the exact weapon that had murdered his family's future. Roland thought he had stripped me of my power when he fired me and froze my bank accounts. He thought he could toss me out into the freezing rain and let me starve in the gutter. He had absolutely no idea what he had just unleashed. I gathered the fragile water-damaged papers and stacked them carefully together, aligning the edges. I placed them gently into my duffel bag, wrapping them securely in a dry cotton shirt to protect them from the damp air. I did not need a high-priced corporate lawyer to understand the absolute power of what I was holding. The legal chain of title was entirely broken. The original foreclosures were undeniably fraudulent. The land under his flagship buildings still legally belonged to the original families. The Hayes Commercial Plaza legally belonged to me. I looked down at Leo. He was watching me with wide, curious eyes. He could see the intense burning fire in my chest. He could see that the defeated, terrified father who had cried in the motel bathroom was completely, permanently gone. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice soft but hopeful. I knelt down and zipped his winter coat all the way up to his chin. I placed my hands firmly on his shoulders and looked him dead in the eyes. I smiled for the very first time since this terrifying nightmare began. It was not a happy or relieved smile. It was the dark, focused smile of a man who finally understands the rules of the game. "We are going to be more than okay, Leo," I said, my voice steady, cold, and absolute. "We are going back to Chicago. We are going to take back every single thing they stole from us, and we are going to watch them lose it all." I stood up, grabbing the duffel bag tightly in my fist. I walked out of the viewing room, leaving the empty metal box sitting wide open on the table. Roland Hayes wanted a war over wealth and power. He thought he was completely untouchable. But I was an accountant holding the true ledger of his life, and I was about to audit his entire existence straight into the ground. We rode the Greyhound bus back across the state line and slipped into the sprawling shadows of the Chicago suburbs. I had $27 left in my pocket. I was holding a duffel bag full of water-damaged paper that held the key to a $100 million empire, but paper does not buy food. Paper does not put a roof over a terrified 10-year-old boy. I needed cash immediately. I walked into a greasy 24-hour diner on the edge of the city limits. The manager was a tired man who did not ask for references or a corporate resume. He handed me a mop and a bucket of bleach. He told me I would get $9 an hour under the table to scrub the floors and clean the grease traps from midnight until 6 in the morning. For 12 years, I had worn custom suits and sat in air-conditioned corner offices. I had audited multinational corporations and presented financial strategies to chief executive officers. Now I was on my hands and knees, scraping baked-on grease off cracked linoleum. The physical pain was sharp and constant. My back ached from bending over the dirty mop bucket. My hands blistered from the harsh industrial chemicals. But every time I felt a wave of humiliation trying to creep into my mind, I thought about my son. Leo was sleeping on a worn-out sofa in the tiny break room in the back of the diner, wrapped tightly in my winter coat. He never complained. He never cried for his mother or the massive, warm bedroom he had left behind. He just trusted me completely. That silent, absolute trust fueled me. Scrubbing those floors was not a demotion. It was my character test. Roland Hayes wanted me to break. He wanted poverty to crush my spirit so I would surrender my son to his high-powered lawyers. But Roland did not understand the quiet, brutal strength of a father who has nothing left to lose. I scrubbed the diner floors until they shined perfectly under the flickering neon lights. I took my meager cash at dawn and bought Leo a hot breakfast. We were surviving on the absolute edge of poverty, but we were surviving on our own terms. When the sun came up, my second job began. We walked to the local public library. The old brick building became our daily sanctuary. Leo would sit across from me at a sturdy wooden table, reading historical books quietly while I went to war. I claimed one of the slow, outdated public computers in the back corner. I pulled the stack of fragile, yellowed property deeds and the 1990s tax ledgers out of my duffel bag. The paper smelled intensely like mold and damp earth. I spread the documents out across the table, hiding them behind a stack of reference books. This was my battlefield. Roland had limitless wealth and political connections, but I had 15 years of intense forensic accounting experience. I knew exactly how money moved. I knew exactly how corrupt men covered their tracks. I began the agonizingly slow process of manually cross-referencing the analog ledgers with the digitized Cook County public property records. It was tedious, grueling work. The library internet connection was painfully slow. The physical ledgers were faded. Some of the blue ink was completely washed away by decades of water damage, forcing me to hold the fragile pages up to the overhead lights just to decipher a single account number. Hour after hour, I typed names, parcel numbers, and tax identification codes into the county database. I tracked the complex movement of every single plot of land listed in those moldy files. By the end of the first week, the disjointed numbers began to form a clear, terrifying picture. I finally connected the dots. The sheer scale of the evil I uncovered made my blood run cold. Roland Hayes was hailed in the press and high society as a visionary real estate developer. Financial magazines praised him for buying up blighted inner-city neighborhoods and transforming them into luxury commercial hubs. The public narrative was that he purchased the land legally and fairly from desperate sellers. That was a complete and absolute lie. Roland never bought the land his $100 million empire was sitting on. He stole it. The tax ledgers in my hands proved exactly how he executed the fraud. In the early 1990s, Roland set up a shadow corporation called Apex Holdings Group. He purposely targeted marginalized elderly black families living in working-class neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. These were highly vulnerable people. Many of them were widows or retired factory workers who owned their homes free and clear. They did not have mortgages. They did not have debt. They were living quiet, peaceful lives on land that Roland secretly wanted for his commercial developments. Roland used Apex Holdings Group to illegally forge property tax liens and fabricated debt collection notices against these specific families. He bribed local city clerks to quietly alter the municipal records. Suddenly, these elderly homeowners were receiving aggressive legal letters stating they owed tens of thousands of dollars in back taxes and phantom corporate loans. When they inevitably could not pay the fabricated debts, Roland used his corrupt connections in the court system to rush through default judgments. He deliberately mailed the legal summons to vacant lots so the families would never show up to defend themselves in court. He legally seized their generational homes through fraudulent foreclosures. He threw elderly men and women out onto the street with absolutely nothing. He stripped them of their dignity, their security, and their legacy. Once he had the land, he transferred the deeds from Apex Holdings Group to his own legitimate real estate development company for mere pennies. He washed the stolen land through his corporate machine. Then he bulldozed their family homes and built his towering glass skyscrapers directly on top of their ruined lives. I sat back in my hard wooden library chair, staring at the computer screen in pure disgust. The documents in front of me were the original unedited ledgers of his crimes. Roland had kept them hidden in that rural Indiana bank vault because they were the only existing proof that his entire empire was built on a foundation of predatory theft and forged documents. He had crushed countless innocent lives to build his massive fortune. He thought his victims were too poor and too powerless to ever fight back. He thought the past was completely buried forever. But there was one specific property that caught my absolute attention. It was the anchor property. The massive plot of land that held the crown jewel of Roland's empire, the Hayes Commercial Plaza. This was the towering glass building that generated the vast majority of his wealth. It was the centerpiece of his entire portfolio. I pulled the deed for this specific plot of land from the bottom of the stack. The paper was incredibly brittle. The edges flaked off onto the table as I carefully handled it. I read the name of the original property owner written in faded black ink. Silas Lincoln. I stopped breathing. The library around me seemed to completely fade away. The low hum of the air conditioner, the quiet chatter of the librarians, everything went entirely silent. I stared at the name. Silas Lincoln. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I reached into my bag and pulled out the faded birth certificate I had found in the bottom of the metal tin. I placed it on the table right next to the property deed. I looked at the name of my father printed on my birth certificate. Then I looked at the name on the deed. They matched perfectly. Silas Lincoln was my grandfather. A crushing wave of realization crashed over me, hitting me with the force of a freight train. My mind flashed back to my childhood. I remembered the heartbreaking stories my mother used to tell me when I was a little boy. She told me we used to have a beautiful, spacious home on the south side. She told me my grandfather had worked in the hot steel mills for 40 years to pay for it. He wanted to leave us a legacy. He wanted to ensure our family would never have to struggle for money. But then my mother would always start crying. She told me the city claimed we owed massive taxes we did not actually owe. She told me men in expensive suits came with armed police officers and forced us out of our home when I was just a baby. The shock and the terrible stress of losing everything had caused my grandfather to suffer a fatal heart attack shortly after the brutal eviction. My mother was forced to raise me in a tiny, crumbling apartment, working 3 minimum wage jobs just to keep me fed. She died young, exhausted, and broken, believing she had somehow failed our family. She did not fail us. We were robbed. We were robbed by Roland Hayes. I gripped the edges of the wooden table to ground myself. The sheer psychological horror of the situation was almost impossible to process. Roland Hayes had specifically targeted my grandfather. He had forged the legal documents that destroyed my family. He had stolen our land and built his massive flagship commercial high-rise directly over the soil where my family home used to stand. But the absolute worst part, the part that made a cold, sick feeling rise in my throat, was the timeline. I met Camille 12 years ago. We fell in love, and I was introduced to her wealthy, powerful father. Roland Hayes had looked me in the eye, shaken my hand, and welcomed me into his home. He knew. He absolutely knew exactly who I was. He knew I was the grandson of the man he had destroyed. He knew my name the exact moment I walked into his mansion. He did not object to the marriage because I was a poor accountant. He allowed the marriage because keeping me close was the ultimate twisted power play. It was a sick, sociopathic game to him. He loved the fact that the grandson of his victim was sitting at his formal dinner table eating his expensive food and wearing suits bought with his money. He loved watching me struggle to pay my bills on my modest salary while he sat on a $100 million empire that legally belonged to my family. He had spent a decade calling me a parasite to my face. He had let Camille and Chloe treat me like an unwanted stray dog. He let them endlessly mock my financial status while knowing perfectly well that he was the exact reason I grew up in poverty. He had engineered my entire life of struggle just to feed his massive, raging ego. I looked down at the birth certificate again. I traced the faded printed letters of my own name with my index finger. The forensic audit was totally complete. The legal chain of title was entirely broken. Because Roland had illegally forged the foreclosure documents in the 1990s, the transfer of ownership to Apex Holdings Group was completely null and void under federal real estate law. That meant the land had never legally changed hands. It meant the property still legally belonged to the estate of Silas Lincoln. And because my father and mother had both passed away without any other children, I was the sole surviving legal heir to the estate. I was not just a wronged grandson seeking an apology. I was the rightful legal owner of the exact plot of land where the Hayes Commercial Plaza currently stood. Roland Hayes did not own his empire. I did. The suffocating fear that had been gripping my chest for the past week evaporated entirely. It was replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Roland had choked my son against a mahogany bookshelf because he was terrified of this exact truth coming to light. He had fired me, frozen my bank accounts, and hired shark lawyers to steal Leo away from me because he thought I was a weak, helpless man who would quietly disappear into the streets out of fear. He thought he had buried the Lincoln family permanently. I looked across the table at Leo. My son was reading his book, completely unaware of the massive, explosive truth sitting on the table between us. I looked at the dark, fading bruises on his neck. Roland had put his violent hands on my child. He had tried to break my boy to protect his stolen crown. I carefully gathered the yellowed deeds, the tax ledgers, and my birth certificate. I placed them inside a waterproof folder and zipped them securely into my duffel bag. This was no longer just about surviving the week. This was no longer just about fighting a desperate custody battle in family court. This was about total, absolute destruction. I was going to use my forensic accounting skills to build a federal legal case, so airtight, so incredibly devastating that Roland Hayes would never see the outside of a prison cell. I was going to take back my grandfather's land. I was going to completely dismantle the illusion of the Hayes family wealth piece by piece, until they had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. I stood up from the library table. I was physically exhausted. My hands still smelled like the harsh industrial bleach from the diner floors. My back was aching from sleeping in a cheap motel chair, but I felt taller and stronger than I had ever felt in my entire life. I walked over to Leo and gently tapped his small shoulder. He closed his book and looked up at me. "Are we done working for today, Dad?" he asked, his voice quiet and steady. I smiled at him. A real, genuine, powerful smile. "Yes, Leo," I said softly. "We are done working. Now we are going to start winning." I walked out of the public library that afternoon with a singular, profound focus. I was holding a battered canvas duffel bag containing the absolute destruction of Roland Hayes. Most men in my position would have let rage dictate their next move. Most men would have stormed up to the security gates of the Hayes Commercial Plaza, demanded to see Roland, and screamed the truth in front of his board of directors. They would have wanted the immediate satisfaction of seeing the fear in his eyes. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in screaming matches. I deal in undeniable, calculated reality. Screaming gives your enemy a warning. Silence builds a trap they can never escape. I walked back to the cheap motel where my son Leo was waiting. I carried the heavy duffel bag close to my chest, protecting it from the damp Chicago wind. Every step I took felt different. The crushing weight of poverty that had paralyzed me just a few days ago was completely gone. Roland Hayes had fired me from my accounting firm and frozen my life savings because he thought money was the only source of power in this world. He believed that if he made me poor, he would make me weak. He fundamentally misunderstood how power actually works. True power is holding the exact weapon that can bring a billionaire to his knees and choosing to stay completely invisible until the perfect moment to strike. When I returned to the motel room, Leo was sitting on the edge of the sagging bed watching television. I sat down next to him and placed my hand on his shoulder. I told him we were going to be staying in this room for a little while longer. I promised him that the bad days were almost over, but I needed to do a lot of difficult paperwork before we could go home. Leo just nodded his head. He did not ask for toys or a big dinner. He just trusted me. I looked at the dark bruises fading on his neck and I made a silent vow. I was not just going to take my son back. I was going to completely dismantle the entire Hayes family. I returned to the greasy diner that evening for my midnight cleaning shift. I spent 6 hours scrubbing baked grease off the kitchen tiles and hauling heavy trash bags out to the dumpster in the freezing alley. I accepted the $9 an hour under the table without a single word of complaint. I used that small handful of cash to buy Leo food and keep the motel room paid for another day. But my mind was never on the dirty water in my mop bucket. My mind was completely consumed by the intricate architecture of the massive fraud I was about to expose. During my 10-minute breaks, I sat in the cramped break room with a legal pad and a cheap pen mapping out every single shell company Roland had used to wash the stolen land. I traced the fraudulent property tax liens from Apex Holdings Group directly to the parent accounts managed by his current real estate firm. The arrogance of the man was absolutely breathtaking. Because he had bribed local city officials and targeted marginalized elderly families in the early 1990s, he believed he was completely invisible. He never accounted for the digital age. He never accounted for a victim's grandson growing up to possess the original wet ink deeds and a mastery of modern federal tax codes. I spent the next 3 days sitting at the slow public library computer, drafting the most comprehensive whistleblower reports the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission had ever seen. I typed thousands of words detailing exactly how Roland had evaded tens of millions of dollars in federal capital gains taxes. I laid out the precise dates, routing numbers, and fraudulent property transfers demonstrating how he washed the stolen land through dummy corporations in Delaware before moving the assets into his primary portfolio. But the absolute most critical piece of my trap was the federal quiet title action. A quiet title action is a powerful lawsuit brought in a court having jurisdiction over property disputes in order to establish a party's title to real property against anyone and everyone. Because the original foreclosures in the 1990s were entirely fabricated, the legal chain of title was permanently broken. I carefully prepared the massive filing for federal court laying absolute legal claim to the ground beneath the Hayes Commercial Plaza. I attached high-resolution scans of my birth certificate, my grandfather's original deed, and the fake foreclosure notices signed by Apex Holdings Group. I was legally asserting that Roland Hayes was trespassing on my property. I knew I could not file these massive federal actions entirely on my own. If a broke, unrepresented man simply mailed a stack of papers to the federal courthouse, Roland's high-powered lawyers would easily bury the filings in endless procedural delays. I needed a powerful ally inside the government. I needed someone with the authority to freeze a billionaire before he could shred his corporate files. Through my old professional accounting networks, I tracked down a pro bono federal prosecutor named William Grant. William was a relentless veteran of the Justice Department who specialized in massive corporate fraud and organized racketeering. He had a fierce reputation for destroying corrupt billionaires, and he absolutely hated men who used wealth to abuse the legal system. I walked into his modest downtown office wearing my only clean suit. I did not ask for his pity. I did not act like a broken victim. I simply sat down across from him and placed the original 1994 tax ledgers, the fraudulent eviction notices, the stolen property deeds, and my faded birth certificate directly onto his desk. William listened to my entire story in absolute silence. He did not interrupt me once. After I finished speaking, he put on his reading glasses and spent 2 solid hours meticulously verifying the corporate registry numbers and cross-referencing the property identification codes I had mapped out on my legal pad. When he finally looked up from the documents, his eyes were wide with total shock. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He told me he had prosecuted organized crime syndicates for 30 years, but he had never seen a paper trail this perfectly preserved and deeply sinister. He told me the level of detailed forensic work I had done in a public library was better than what a team of federal agents could accomplish in 6 months. He looked me dead in the eye and said Roland Hayes was looking at a mandatory minimum of 40 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny wire fraud and federal tax evasion. We spent the next 48 hours working together in complete secrecy inside his office. William secured emergency sealed federal warrants. We coordinated directly with the directors of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. We established a firm timeline to ensure that the exact moment the family court judge reviewed my quiet title action, every single bank account, holding company, and trust fund attached to the Hayes family would be instantly and permanently frozen by the federal government. The trap was set and armed. All we had to do was wait for Roland, Camille, and Chloe to confidently walk right into it. While William and I were quietly assembling the legal guillotine that would end their entire dynasty, the Hayes family was busy aggressively celebrating their perceived victory. Because Camille had successfully drained our joint savings accounts, she assumed I was completely paralyzed and broken. Through the mandatory family court disclosures, their high-priced attorney, Thomas Sterling, filed a motion for an expedited custody hearing. In those arrogant legal filings, Camille claimed she was creating a stable, luxurious, and protective environment for Leo. But the reality of their lifestyle was absolutely nauseating. I saw the overwhelming evidence of their extreme arrogance everywhere. Leo had kept an old tablet device that still had access to a shared family photo album over the cloud. He silently showed me the pictures and videos Camille and Chloe were posting online every single day. They were living in a completely different reality. While I was scrubbing greasy diner floors at 2 a.m. just to afford a hot breakfast for my son, Camille was posting pictures from an exclusive luxury boutique on the Magnificent Mile. She was smiling brightly for the camera, holding a custom-tailored dress that cost more than my first car. The caption beneath the photo read, "Securing the perfect outfit for a perfect victory in court this Friday." She was actively treating the permanent loss of her son's father as an excuse to go on a massive, gleeful shopping spree. Chloe was somehow even worse. My elitist sister-in-law hosted an extravagant private dinner party at their extremely exclusive country club. She posted a long, arrogant video giving a toast with a $500 glass of imported champagne. She laughed loudly and told her wealthy friends that her sister was finally dropping the dead weight and upgrading her life. She called me a tragic financial mistake that they were officially erasing from the family tree forever. She openly boasted that Roland was about to secure sole custody of Leo and mold him into a proper, ruthless heir to the Hayes fortune. The sheer cruelty of watching them celebrate the destruction of my family made my blood boil, but I channeled every ounce of that anger into my preparation. And then there was Roland. Just 2 days before the scheduled family court custody hearing, a major national financial magazine published a glowing feature profile on his career. I read the article on a library computer monitor. The main photograph showed Roland sitting in his massive leather chair inside his penthouse office, smiling like a benevolent, untouchable king. He talked at length about his brilliant real estate instincts and his deep philanthropic commitment to improving the city of Chicago. He actually had the absolute nerve to say his greatest achievement was building his massive empire from the ground up through hard, honest work and fair negotiations. He bragged about the Hayes Commercial Plaza, calling it a permanent monument to his family's enduring legacy. He stated confidently that his wealth would secure the Hayes family for 10 generations to come. They were all completely intoxicated by their own perceived power. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars booking luxury vacations to Europe and planning a massive private gala for the upcoming weekend to celebrate winning full legal custody of Leo. They sincerely believed they had crushed me like an insignificant insect. They thought I was sitting in a dark, filthy motel room, weeping over my empty pockets, too terrified to even show my face in public. They had absolutely no idea that every single dollar they were spending, every expensive glass of champagne they were drinking, and every square inch of the enormous mansion they were sleeping in was built on stolen land that legally belonged to me. They did not know that a highly specialized team of federal agents was quietly monitoring every single wire transfer they made. They did not know that the Securities and Exchange Commission was actively preparing to lock the doors to their banks. I sat in the small motel room on Thursday night, the eve of the family court hearing. I watched Leo sleeping peacefully on the faded bedspread. I felt a profound, cold silence settle deeply into my bones. The violent screaming match in the study, the vicious betrayal by my wife, the humiliation from Chloe, and the terror of the bank freeze all felt like a distant, fading lifetime ago. I was no longer the broke, desperate father they had thrown out into the freezing rain. I was the silent architect of their total destruction. And tomorrow morning, in a crowded Chicago courtroom, they were going to find out exactly who they had stolen from. The morning of the family court hearing was brutally cold. The Chicago wind whipped off the lake, carrying a bitter chill that seemed to cut straight through my thin wool coat. I walked up the massive granite steps of the Cook County Courthouse. Every single step felt incredibly heavy. This was the arena where lives were dismantled and futures were decided. For most people, walking into family court is a nightmare of emotional chaos. But I am a forensic accountant. I had spent the last several days mapping out the destruction of a billionaire. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, mechanical focus. My pro bono attorney, William Grant, walked quietly beside me holding a thick leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the absolute end of the Hayes family dynasty. We had arranged for my son Leo to sit safely in a secure waiting room with a court-appointed social worker. I refused to let my boy watch the monsters in his family try to tear me apart. I wanted to face them alone. We pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked through the metal detectors. The courthouse hallway was a cavern of polished marble and echoing voices. As we approached courtroom 402, I saw them. They were standing outside the heavy wooden doors, looking like they owned the entire building. Roland Hayes stood in the center of the group. He was wearing a dark charcoal bespoke suit that probably cost more than my first car. His posture was rigid and dominant. He looked perfectly rested and entirely untouchable. Standing next to him was my wife Camille. She did not look like a mother fighting for the safety of her child. She looked like she was attending an exclusive morning gala. She wore a tailored designer dress and a string of pearls resting against her collarbone. She was busy checking her phone, completely detached from the reality of the situation. And then there was Chloe. My white sister-in-law stood beside Camille, holding an imported leather handbag and sipping from a paper coffee cup. Chloe had always viewed me as a financial mistake that stained her elite social circle. When she saw me walking down the long marble hallway, her eyes lit up with pure malicious joy. She leaned in close to Camille, but she made absolutely sure her voice was loud enough to carry down the echoing corridor. "Look at him," Chloe sneered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "He looks like a homeless beggar who wandered in from the street to ask for spare change." "I told you, Camille, you cut off his money and he instantly reverts to exactly what he always was, a pathetic street rat." Camille looked up from her phone. Her eyes met mine. There was no warmth left in her gaze. There was only a cold, blank emptiness. She looked at my wrinkled suit jacket and the dark circles under my eyes. She let out a soft, dismissive scoff and turned her back to me. Roland simply smiled. It was the same dark, predatory smile he had given me right after he choked my son against the mahogany bookshelf. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and walked confidently into the courtroom. He honestly believed he was walking into a slaughter. He believed I was the lamb. William Grant placed a firm hand on my shoulder. He did not say a word, but his grip told me everything I needed to know. We let them walk in first. Then we followed them inside and took our seats at the plain wooden defense table. The courtroom was vast and intimidating. The walls were lined with dark oak panels, and the high ceiling made every sound feel heavy and official. Roland sat directly behind Camille in the gallery. He crossed his legs and rested his arms across the back of the wooden pew, projecting total ownership of the room. Camille sat at the plaintiff's table next to Thomas Sterling. Sterling was a legendary family court shark. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and carried himself with the aggressive arrogance of a man who had never lost a case in his life. Judge Patricia Moreno entered the room. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience on the bench. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone sat down. Judge Moreno opened the thick file on her desk and adjusted her glasses. She stated that we were here for an emergency hearing regarding the primary physical and legal custody of Leo Lincoln. She noted the severe allegations in the file and looked directly at me with a harsh, skeptical glare. The stage was set. The trap was open. Thomas Sterling stood up immediately. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked slowly toward the center of the room. He did not just present a legal argument. He launched a calculated, brutal assassination of my entire existence. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice echoing loudly across the silent courtroom. "We are here today to protect a vulnerable 10-year-old boy from a father who has completely spiraled out of control. My client, Camille Lincoln, is a pillar of the Chicago community. She provides a stable, luxurious, and deeply loving home. The man sitting across this room provides nothing but violence and absolute financial ruin." Sterling paced back and forth, letting his words hang heavily in the air. He pointed a sharp finger directly at my chest. "Andre Lincoln is a desperate and dangerous man, Your Honor. Just 5 days ago, he was terminated from his accounting firm under a cloud of deep suspicion. He has absolutely no income. He has no permanent address. He is currently residing in a filthy roadside motel that is entirely unfit for human habitation. But poverty is not his only crime. When his financial schemes collapsed, Mr. Lincoln turned to violence. We have sworn affidavits proving that he physically attacked my clients, Father Roland Hayes, in a desperate attempt to extort the family for gambling money. When Mr. Hayes bravely refused to be blackmailed, this man violently abducted his own son and dragged him into the freezing rain. I sat perfectly still. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not clench my fists. I did not shake my head. I sat with the cold, calculated posture of a forensic accountant evaluating a completely false ledger. Inside my chest, my heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic power. I listened to Sterling spin a web of absolute lies. I listened to him portray a billionaire monster as a brave victim. I watched Roland sitting in the gallery, nodding his head sadly, playing the role of the wounded grandfather to absolute perfection. Sterling continued, his voice rising in dramatic indignation. My client had to freeze their joint bank accounts just to prevent this unstable man from fleeing the state with stolen funds. We have a temporary restraining order currently in place. Your Honor, a man who cannot hold a job, a man who attacks elderly family members, a man who has no home and no money, has absolutely no right to determine the future of a child. We are asking the court to grant Camille Lincoln sole legal and physical custody immediately. We are asking the court to permanently terminate Andre Lincoln's visitation rights to ensure the absolute safety of this boy. Sterling walked back to his table and sat down next to Camille. Camille kept her eyes fixed firmly on the judge playing the part of the traumatized mother. Roland leaned back in the gallery and crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a smug, untouchable smile. He was absolutely certain he had won. He had used his vast wealth to purchase a completely fabricated reality. He thought he had successfully buried the truth under a mountain of expensive legal paperwork. Judge Moreno looked over her glasses at my table. She frowned deeply. The allegations presented by the plaintiff were overwhelming. If they were true, I was exactly the kind of monster the family court system was designed to destroy. The judge asked my attorney if we had a response to these incredibly severe charges. William Grant stood up very slowly. He did not rush. He did not display any of the frantic, aggressive energy that Sterling had just utilized. Grant was a veteran federal prosecutor. He moved with the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man holding an atomic bomb. He picked up his thick leather briefcase and placed it squarely on the defense table. He popped the brass latches with 2 loud, sharp clicks that echoed across the silent room. Your Honor, Grant said, his voice calm, deep, and completely void of emotion. We do have a response, but my client is not here today to argue about motel rooms or frozen bank accounts. We are not here to debate the fabricated narrative of a desperate man. We are here to address a catastrophic federal crime that completely invalidates the plaintiff's entire standing in this court. Thomas Sterling shot up from his chair. He slammed his hand on his table and objected loudly. He claimed that opposing counsel was attempting to introduce irrelevant and inflammatory material to distract from my complete lack of parental fitness. Judge Moreno raised her hand, ordering Sterling to sit down. She looked at William Grant with a mixture of curiosity and deep caution. She warned Grant that he was walking a very thin line and instructed him to explain exactly how his statements were relevant to a family court custody dispute. Grant walked slowly toward the bench, holding a thick stack of documents enclosed in a heavy blue folder. It is entirely relevant, Your Honor, because the plaintiff's claim that they provide a stable financial environment for the child is based on a massive ongoing criminal fraud. The wealth they are citing as proof of their parental superiority does not actually belong to them. It belongs entirely to my client, Andre Lincoln. The courtroom went completely dead. The absolute silence was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I slowly turned my head and looked at Roland Hayes in the gallery. The smug, untouchable smile had instantly vanished from his face. He uncrossed his arms and sat forward, his dark eyes locking onto the blue folder in William Grant's hands. Camille looked confused. Chloe frowned, her elite arrogance cracking just a fraction. Sterling jumped up again, his voice frantic. Your Honor, this is an absurd and completely baseless accusation. My client's father, Roland Hayes, is one of the most respected commercial real estate developers in the state of Illinois. His wealth is a matter of public record. Opposing counsel is making a desperate, slanderous attempt to smear a respected family. Judge Moreno ignored Sterling entirely. She reached over the high wooden bench and took the heavy blue folder from William Grant's hands. She opened it and began reading the top page. I watched the judge's eyes scan the text. I watched her brow furrow in deep confusion. Mr. Grant, The judge said slowly, her voice full of extreme caution. "What exactly am I looking at here?" "This is a federal court filing." "That is correct, Your Honor," Grant replied, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "What you are holding is a copy of a verified federal quiet title action filed at 6:00 this morning in the United States District Court. It is accompanied by a massive federal injunction currently being executed by the Securities and Exchange Commission." Grant turned his back to the judge and looked directly at Roland Hayes. Roland was gripping the edge of the wooden pew in front of him. His knuckles were turning completely white. For the past 30 years, Roland Hayes has built a $100 million real estate empire on a foundation of absolute predatory theft. Grant stated, his voice rising in power and authority. In the early 1990s, Mr. Hayes created a shadow corporation known as Apex Holdings Group. He used this anonymous shell company to target marginalized elderly homeowners in the South Loop of Chicago. He illegally forged property tax liens. He completely fabricated debt collection notices. He utilized corrupt local officials to push through fraudulent foreclosures against vulnerable families who owned their homes free and clear. He legally stole their generational wealth, demolished their homes, and built his luxury commercial skyscrapers directly on top of their stolen land. Sterling was shouting objections at the top of his lungs, but his voice sounded like distant static. The judge was completely engrossed in the documents, reading the undeniable proof of the fraud. Camille turned around in her chair and looked at her father. She was expecting Roland to stand up and shout that this was a lie. She was expecting him to use his massive power to crush the accusation, but Roland did not speak. His face was entirely pale. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple. He was staring at the exact documents he had hidden in a rural Indiana bank vault 30 years ago. He was staring at the ghosts he thought he had successfully buried forever. Grant walked back to our table and pulled a second set of documents from his briefcase. He walked back to the bench and handed them to the judge. "Your Honor, the document you are looking at now is the original wet ink deed to the anchor property of the Hayes Commercial Plaza. The property was brutally and illegally stolen from a hardworking man named Silas Lincoln. Silas Lincoln died of a massive heart attack shortly after Roland Hayes fraudulently evicted him from his family home." Grant paused, letting the devastating reality of the statement settle over the room. He turned and pointed directly at me. "Silas Lincoln was my client's grandfather. Because the foreclosure was executed using highly illegal and fabricated corporate documents, the legal chain of title is entirely void under federal real estate law. The land never legally transferred to Apex Holdings Group. The land never legally transferred to Roland Hayes. The land has always belonged to the estate of Silas Lincoln. And because my client Andre Lincoln is the sole surviving heir, he is the absolute legal owner of the ground beneath the Hayes Commercial Plaza." The sound of a heavy gasp echoed through the courtroom. It came from Chloe. The elite snobby sister-in-law was sitting in the gallery with her hand covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide with pure terror. She was looking at Roland, realizing that the massive fortune she had married into was an absolute mirage. She realized she was not standing in the winner's circle. She was standing on a trap door. Camille stood up from her chair, her hands trembling violently. She looked at her high-powered attorney, demanding him to do something to fix this. But Thomas Sterling was perfectly quiet. He was staring at the federal injunction on the judge's desk. Sterling was a shark, but he was not an idiot. He recognized a federal death sentence when he saw one. He slowly stepped away from Camille, physically distancing himself from the toxic implosion of the Hayes family. Judge Moreno looked up from the documents. Her face was completely drained of color. She looked at Roland Hayes, sitting in the gallery. Then she looked down at Camille. The harsh, skeptical glare she had given me at the beginning of the hearing was entirely gone. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, her voice trembling slightly, "this federal injunction orders the immediate and total freeze of all financial assets, corporate holding accounts, and personal trusts tied to Roland Hayes and his direct dependents. That includes the personal accounts of your client, Camille Lincoln." Camille let out a sharp, terrified cry. She gripped the edge of her table, shaking her head in complete denial. "No," she screamed, her voice cracking. "No, you cannot do that. That is my money. I transferred that money to protect it from him. You cannot freeze my accounts. I have nothing else." Judge Moreno banged her wooden gavel sharply, cutting off Camille's frantic screaming. "Mrs. Lincoln, your financial assets are currently considered the proceeds of a massive organized criminal enterprise," the judge stated with absolute finality. "This court will not grant custody of a child to a family facing imminent federal racketeering charges. In light of this overwhelming evidence, I am immediately dismissing your petition for sole custody. I am lifting the fabricated restraining order against Mr. Lincoln, and I am granting Andre Lincoln full and immediate primary physical custody of his son." The judge slammed her gavel down one final time. The loud crack echoed through the courtroom, signaling the absolute end of the Hayes family dynasty. The illusion of their extreme wealth had been shattered into a million pieces. The empire Roland Hayes had built on the bones of my family was completely collapsing right before his eyes. I sat at the defense table, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not cheer. I did not smile. I did not jump up and down. I watched my grandfather's murderer realize that his entire life was completely over. I watched the woman who threw my wedding ring on the floor realize she was absolutely penniless. I had walked into this courtroom as a ghost, but I was walking out as a king, and the real devastation for the Hayes family was only just beginning. The sharp crack of Judge Patricia Moreno's wooden gavel hung in the heavy air of the courtroom. For a long moment, nobody dared to breathe. The absolute reality of what had just happened was simply too massive for the room to process all at once. Roland Hayes, the untouchable commercial real estate billionaire who had strangled my 10-year-old son against a mahogany bookshelf, was completely paralyzed. He slowly stood up from the polished wooden bench in the gallery. His hands were visibly trembling. The rich, confident color of his face had entirely drained away, leaving behind a sickly, pale gray. He looked down at his custom-tailored charcoal suit, as if he expected the expensive fabric to somehow protect him from the massive federal trap I had just triggered. It could not. Before Roland could even attempt to utter a single word, the heavy double doors at the very back of the courtroom swung wide open with a violent metallic crash. 6 federal agents marched purposefully into the room. They were dressed in dark, tactical windbreakers with bold yellow letters printed across their backs. Some read FBI and others read SEC. These were not the local beat cops or the easily bought precinct captains that Roland regularly bribed with campaign donations. These men and women moved with absolute surgical precision. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern jawline, walked directly down the center aisle. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at my panicked wife, Camille. His cold eyes were locked entirely on Roland Hayes. "Roland Hayes," the agent announced, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceiling. "You are under arrest for multiple federal charges, including grand larceny, wire fraud, criminal embezzlement, and systemic property theft. Place your hands behind your back immediately." Roland stumbled backward, his immense arrogance completely shattered. He bumped into the wooden pew behind him, nearly losing his balance. He raised his hands in a frantic defensive gesture. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Roland shouted, his voice cracking with pure terror. "I own half the commercial real estate in the South Loop. I play golf with your regional director. I demand to speak with my attorneys right now. You cannot walk into a courtroom and do this to me." The lead agent did not slow his pace. He stepped directly into the gallery, grabbed Roland's right arm, and twisted it firmly behind his back. The sound of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around the billionaire's wrists echoed like a gunshot. "Your properties are currently being seized by the federal government under a criminal forfeiture warrant," the agent replied in a flat, completely unbothered tone. "You do not own anything anymore, Mr. Hayes. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." I sat completely still at the defense table. I did not cheer. I did not smile. I watched with absolute icy calm as they stripped away every single ounce of dignity the man possessed. They marched Roland Hayes out of the gallery and dragged him down the center aisle. As he passed my table, he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute hatred and profound shock. He finally realized that the quiet accountant he had mocked the son-in-law he had thrown into the freezing rain was the exact architect of his total destruction. He opened his mouth to speak, but the federal agents shoved him forward, marching him out the double doors and into the custody of the United States justice system. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. My wife Camille sprang up from the plaintiff's table. She was completely frantic. She grabbed the sleeve of her high-powered attorney, Thomas Sterling, and began shaking his arm. "Thomas, do something!" Camille screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Call the judge! Call the mayor! You have to stop them! They cannot just take my father like a common criminal!" "Tell them to unfreeze my bank accounts right now." Thomas Sterling yanked his arm out of her grasp with shocking force. The legendary family court shark wanted absolutely nothing to do with her. He aggressively shoved his legal pads and gold pens into his thick leather briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. "Mrs. Lincoln Sterling," said his voice dripping with venomous disgust, "the Securities and Exchange Commission has just filed a blanket federal injunction against your entire family tree. Every single dollar in your bank accounts, every trust fund, every mutual fund, and every single line of credit has been instantly frozen as the proceeds of organized crime. You are completely toxic. My firm does not represent federal racketeers. You owe me $40,000 for this morning's appearance, but I know I will never see a single penny of it. Do not ever contact my office again." Sterling turned his back on her and practically ran out of the courtroom, desperate to distance his prestigious law firm from the massive implosion of the Hayes dynasty. Camille stood entirely alone at the plaintiff's table. She was hyperventilating. She pulled her expensive smartphone out of her designer handbag with shaking fingers. She frantically opened her mobile banking application. I watched her perfectly manicured thumb tap the screen over and over again. She gasped loudly. The screen was flashing a bright red error code indicating that her entire financial portfolio was permanently locked by federal order. The millions of dollars she had drained from our joint savings account, the massive wealth she had chosen over her own husband and child, had completely vanished into thin air. She was absolutely penniless. In the gallery behind her, Chloe was experiencing her own total breakdown. My elitist white sister-in-law had spent the entire morning whispering insults about my wrinkled suit and mocking my temporary poverty. Now she was staring at her own glowing phone screen in absolute horror. Her husband David was calling her repeatedly. I could hear his panicked voice bleeding out of the tiny speaker. David was screaming that federal agents were actively raiding his corporate office downtown. Chloe dropped her paper coffee cup onto the marble floor. She pulled at her own blonde hair, sobbing hysterically. Her country club memberships, her luxury imported vehicles, and her perfect elite social standing had evaporated in less than 2 minutes. My pro bono attorney, William Grant, leaned over and patted my shoulder. He gave me a quiet, respectful nod. "We are done here, Andre," he said softly. "The federal authorities will handle the rest. Go get your boy." I stood up from the defense table. I buttoned my suit jacket. I picked up my canvas duffel bag containing the original wet ink deeds and the faded birth certificate that proved I was the sole legal heir to the Hayes Commercial Plaza. I did not look at Camille. I did not look at Chloe. I simply turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them completely drowning in the ruins of their own greed. The long marble hallway outside the courtroom was quiet. I took a deep breath of the cool air, feeling the massive, suffocating weight of the past week finally lift from my chest. I started walking toward the secure family waiting area at the end of the corridor where my son Leo was sitting safely with the court-appointed social worker. But before I could reach the end of the hall, I heard the frantic clicking of high heels running on the marble floor behind me. "Andre, wait. Please wait." I stopped and slowly turned around. Camille and Chloe were sprinting down the hallway, desperately trying to catch up to me. They looked absolutely pathetic. Camille's flawless makeup was completely ruined by dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. Chloe's designer handbag was slipping off her shoulder. They were no longer the arrogant, untouchable royalty who had strutted into the building an hour ago. They were completely broken, terrified women who suddenly realized that the ghost they had tried to bury was actually the man holding all the keys to their survival. Camille threw herself in front of me, blocking my path. She actually dropped to her knees on the cold, hard marble floor. She reached out with both hands and grabbed the fabric of my trousers, sobbing hysterically. "Andre, I am so sorry," Camille cried, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes. "I was so confused. My father manipulated me. He lied to me, Andre. He told me you were trying to steal from us. He told me you were violent. You know how powerful he is. I was terrified of him. I never wanted to take Leo away from you. I never wanted to throw you out into the rain. Please, Andre, you have to believe me. We can fix this. You are my husband. We can be a family again." Chloe pushed forward, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. Her elite, snobby accent was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic whining whimper. "Andre, you have to help us," Chloe begged, tears pouring down her face. "David is going to be arrested. They are going to take my house. They are going to take my cars. You own the land, Andre. The lawyer said you are the legal owner of the entire commercial plaza. You are worth hundreds of millions of dollars now. You have the power to drop the federal quiet title action. You can tell the federal prosecutors to back off. Please, Andre. I know I was cruel to you, but we are family. You cannot just leave us with absolutely nothing." I looked down at the two women groveling at my feet. For 12 years, I had endured their endless judgment. I had swallowed my pride every time they mocked my $70,000 salary. I had stayed silent every time they reminded me that I did not belong in their wealthy world. I had desperately tried to be a good, loyal husband to Camille, hoping that my love would eventually be enough to make her happy. But when the ultimate test arrived, she had not chosen love. She had not chosen the safety of her bruised and terrified son. She had chosen the illusion of money. I looked at them with absolute icy calm. There was no rage left inside my heart. There was only a profound clinical emptiness. "Get up, Camille." I said, my voice dangerously low and completely flat. "Stand up right now." "Right." Camille slowly let go of my trousers and scrambled to her feet, wiping her ruined face. She looked at me with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope, thinking my calm demeanor meant I was willing to forgive her. "You were not manipulated by your father," I told her, staring directly into her tear-filled eyes. "You knew exactly who he was. When you walked into that study and saw the dark purple bruises blooming on your own son's neck, you did not ask if he was okay. You did not ask for a doctor. You looked at the billionaire bleeding on the floor and you made a calculated financial transaction. You traded your husband and your child for a trust fund." Camille flinched as if I had physically slapped her. "Andre, please," she whimpered. "I made a mistake." "You made a choice," I corrected her sharply. "And Chloe, you made a choice too. You chose to stand in a beautiful mansion and call a father a street rat while you helped orchestrate a legal plot to kidnap his son. You both thought poverty would break my mind. You thought my lack of a trust fund meant I was a weak, helpless man." I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag on my shoulder and took one step closer to them. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You chose the illusion of power over your own family," I said, delivering the final devastating blow with surgical precision. "You tried to bury me, but you forgot I am an accountant. I do not just count the money. I trace the lies. I know exactly where the money came from, and I know exactly where it is going. You built your entire lives on a foundation of stolen land that legally belongs to my grandfather. The federal government is going to seize every single asset you possess to pay restitution for decades of fraud. I am not going to save you. I am not going to leave you a single dime. You are going to learn exactly how it feels to walk out into a freezing storm with absolutely nothing." I did not wait for their response. I did not care to hear another pathetic apology. I simply turned my back on them and walked down the hallway. Behind me, I could hear Camille collapse against the marble wall, releasing a long, agonizing wail of pure despair. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably, cursing her husband and her own terrible luck. The sound of their total destruction echoed loudly off the polished stone, but I did not stop walking. I did not look back. They were ghosts to me now. I reached the heavy wooden door of the secure family waiting room. I pushed it open. The room was warm and quiet. The court-appointed social worker was sitting at a small table filling out paperwork. Sitting on the small sofa in the corner was my son Leo. He was reading a comic book. When he heard the door open, he looked up. He saw my face. He did not ask what the judge said. He did not ask about his grandfather or his mother. He just dropped his comic book, jumped off the sofa, and ran straight into my arms. I dropped my duffel bag and caught him holding him tightly against my chest. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair. The dark bruises on his neck were still there, but the terror in his eyes was completely gone. He was safe. We had walked through the absolute fires of hell together, and we had survived. We can go home now. Leo, I whispered, holding him close. We never have to run again. As we walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright morning sunshine, the storm clouds above Chicago were finally beginning to break apart. I held my son's hand tightly, realizing that the long, terrifying nightmare was officially over. There is a profound lesson hidden inside the brutal reality of survival. Most people spend their entire lives chasing the loud, flashy victories. They worship imported cars, luxury mansions, and offshore bank accounts, never realizing that they are standing on a foundation that is actively crumbling beneath their feet. They believe that true power is the ability to intimidate the weak. But real wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the numbers on a banking app. Real wealth is the undeniable strength of a father's promise to protect his child. It is the absolute courage to stand in the freezing rain when the rest of the world has completely abandoned you. It is the quiet, relentless determination to keep digging when you are buried in the dark until you find the exact truth that will set you free. Roland Hayes wanted to destroy me because he thought my modest salary made me a pathetic loser. He handed me a rusted key, thinking it was a meaningless piece of garbage. He did not realize he was handing me the exact instrument of his own demise. Sometimes the cruelest, darkest moments of your life are actually disguising the greatest victories you will ever achieve. You just have to be strong enough to survive the storm and smart enough to trace the lies. If this story reminded you that true justice always finds a way to balance the ledger, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it right now. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you found incredible strength in your darkest moment. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell for more stories of deep secrets, unyielding survival, and ultimate justice. Thank you for listening. Keep fighting for the truth.